Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our training on PPPs today. My name is Nicholas Chimu, and I'll be your moderator for this session. But before we start, we are greatly honored today to have our Vice President of the Uganda Law Society visiting, and she's going to be making the opening remarks before we start the presentations. So ladies and gentlemen, allow me to welcome our Vice President to take it on from here. Thank you, Diana.
Thank you, Nicholas. It's nice to be here. As you can see, we're in a fancy place where we're seated, and I'm glad to be a part of you here today. My name is Diana Ngwech. I am the Vice President of Uganda Law Society, and I have been asked to make a few remarks on behalf of the Uganda Law Society. As you can see, we're coming to you online, which is part of what COVID presented to us. Before we started COVID or the pandemic hit the country, we had all CLEs were required to be physical. But the opportunity with COVID is that it gave us a time to come online, and today is one of those days where we get to meet online and still have very quality training. Today we'll be talking about PPPs, and I'm sure as many have signed in and prepared to be a part of it, you are quite excited, as well as you're looking for ways and opportunities that the legal profession can engage in this particular sector. We'll be having experts from the PPP unit under the Ministry of Finance. I want to say that recently we applied, during COVID, we applied for a bid that we did not get. I think that will be my first question today, why we were not able to be put amongst the people that won a bid to the Ministry of Finance, especially because it was COVID season and we had to come from our homes and deliver a physical copy. My hope is that they will explain to me why we were unable to win that bid as a PPP practitioner. We shall also be talking about the legal and institutional framework governing the country. We know that few professionals have engaged in this space, and today we want to talk about the opportunities that government provides, as well as how practitioners can position themselves to participate in this particular sector. I know for a while we've debated about local content and our right to participate. We call it a right because I think lawyers assume that they have a right to everything, including rights that are beyond Chapter 4 of the Constitution. But we believe that in terms of local content, as we talk about local content, we have spoken about lawyers participating and not just having external firms advise the government and different people that come to our nation. So as we debate that, we want to arm ourselves with knowledge and knowledge from people who are well versed with this sector, and we're going to welcome the members from the PPP unit who will be discussing. They will be increasingly telling us the opportunities, the projects that government is doing, as well as discussing from a lawyer's perspective the opportunities that we have within the sector. Today we have distinguished practitioners, as Nicholas is one of them, and he has introduced us. They are distinguished in this area. I was talking to Nicholas earlier on, and he said to me that there are very few practitioners. He actually could name them off his hands, which is quite sad. And my hope today for the membership online is that we will be able to arm ourselves and be that practitioner that Nicholas can name on his hand. We have the opportunity to be hosted by Sebalu Wanule, so I'd like to thank you for giving us this space as Law Society. As part of our mandate in Law Society, we provide legal aid. We provide continuing legal education. You know, when you're the head of legal aid, you always think about legal aid under Uganda Law Society. But as part of our mandate in Uganda Law Society, we are required to provide continuing legal education for our members. And our desire is to become a proficient bar association. Part of this is what we do today in having this discussion. We want to expose our members to opportunities in the sector and also opportunities around the country as a whole. ULS is committed to fulfilling its mandate, and today as we start this training, allow me on behalf of Uganda Law Society to welcome you and to thank our members who will be teaching us and training us, but also especially thank Sebalu Wandule for hosting us today. Thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President, for those warm remarks as we open this session. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize once again for starting a little late. but we are just concerned at 9 o'clock we only had about 16 people online, and we're wondering whether that would be an optimal number. So we just had to wait a little bit so we could have a critical mass of members today before we could start. Ladies and gentlemen, we will quickly move now to our presentations. I was just reminded that I didn't introduce myself, but I know that the lawyers know me. But for those who don't know me, my name is Nicholas Echimu. I head the projects and infrastructure practice at S&L Advocates. And I had the opportunity of working for the Ministry of Finance at some point in the course of my career. And during that time, I met two wonderful gentlemen whom I'll introduce to you shortly. I will introduce to you Mr. Jim Mugunga. He's the Executive Director of the Public-Private Partnership Unit of the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development of Uganda. And today Jim will be taking us through what do PPPs in Uganda actually mean. Somebody actually sent me a comment this morning, a good friend of mine called Edgar, to ask me whether this was Bidandi Sali's party. We are not talking about political parties here. We are talking about live transactions that change lives. And I know that Jim will be able to articulate some of the things. So without wasting much time, may I now invite Jim to join me here so that he can start on his first presentation. Jim, you're most welcome. Thank you. And Jim, feel free. I may have nominally introduced you. If you're Salongo, if you're OHT1 and other titles, please, it will just be good for us to know as we start this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, and it's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Uganda Law Society for inviting us to present this training. But most importantly, we would wish to thank S&L for hosting us. Thank you very much. If I could just start with quick comments on one or two things that the Vice President raised, so that I'm in comfort zone. It's actually a good thing to have bid. I'm not familiar with what this bid was about. I'm not trying to be defensive, but it's also a good thing to hear that Uganda Law Society can actually bid for work. I hope it was Uganda Law Society. Oh, it was okay. Yeah,
the farm.
It was the farm. Okay. So, but the tenders and procurement and the contracting are quite becoming a lot more specialized. They are not the things you do one-off. They are not the things you do ad hoc. So I think going forward, and probably some of the things we should be discussing in future, is how to create specialization in such areas so that you just do not say, look, somebody has advertised an opportunity and oh yes, we can actually bid. This is a science. You have to be in there, you have to have people who are competing, and there are tender houses which have been created in other places where people actually spend time preparing bids, and that's the specialty. And it's a science, as I was saying, which you eventually have to to be deliberate at. So hopefully that experience was a wake-up call. Yes, but going forward, we hope to see a lot more of those applications coming through. So I was asked to speak about the evolution, and I think we have it's always good to go back in time. Maybe before I talk about the definition, the evolution will come fast ahead of the definition, so that we know where we've come from. Back in the days, we all went to school and were told about this huge company that came to Africa, to the interior of Africa, to pick raw materials, breach something. Geological Society, which funded most of these tours, and eventually they took wood, they took coffee, all the raw materials that they needed. But rarely would you hear about indigenous companies as entrepreneurs or businesses that participated in this. So for me, I think this is where you can trace private sector engagement into business, into whether it's infrastructure, whether it's entrepreneurship, and so on. I think this is where we should go. We go back in the days, and we realize part of the things that forced African, particularly most of the countries, including ours, to push for independence was because they felt left out of the economic state. They were governed, but they never played a role. So they pushed for the opportunities to be given. They were not given, and hence the start of the wars back in the days. I'm told there was Cotton War, and then all wars based around commodities and the trade and the ivory and so on. And for me, that's, I think, the beginning of where engagement, private sector engagement, the seed for private sector engagement, for the demand to be represented into the nation state started. And then fast forward, I could go on and explain what happened, but you know that during independence, before independence, of course, our colonial masters created these huge companies that were centrally located into the public sector. So there were public sector companies working with the locals as suppliers, but not necessarily as partners. And that was a drain. You move on to post-independence. Our fathers, fathers who gave birth to independent Uganda, for example, they pushed for creation of entities as national enterprises. So you had the things like Uganda Electricity Board, you had things like Uganda Post and Telecommunications Company, you had the Uganda Transport Company. These were symbols of state. They were still funded and wholly owned by government, by the public sector. You and me had to pay to sustain them. They were seen as the employers. They were seen as those symbols that created the nation, and you had to be part of them to feel good about being part of the nation. Fast forward again, later we realized that, wait a moment, these things which we created must be sustainable. And to be sustainable, they have to create money. They have to be viable. To create money, they must be efficiently run. And because of the experiences we had, of course, governance issues and other issues that we could all mention, time came when a whole reorganization of the national enterprise or state companies had to be undertaken as a reality of the drain that these companies were having on the budget. In other words, you had to spend so much to sustain them against the deliverables that they were bringing in. So the balance between what they were producing and what we were spending to sustain them wasn't there. So to make sure that this is achieved, of course, a restructuring of sorts had to happen. Now that restructuring took several modes. The first one was, of course, the state enterprises. In other words, the opportunities in the 80s was restructure them so that you allow the private sector to play an increasingly bigger role in the state enterprises, as opposed to government shouldering the entire weight of retaining them as symbols of the state. So the beginning of opening up started around there. And some people have called it the collapse of government, depending on which lenses they use, because government has to employ people, and people are not employed now, blah, blah, blah. On the other hand, others have said, wait a moment, we managed to free resources. So instead of having all of these 20,000 people employed by Uganda Post and Telecommunications Company, let the business of Uganda Post and Telecommunications Company inform the company on the volumes, on the numbers that they have to retain, because that can be supported by the balance sheet. And that's the science. So it's not necessarily that the restructuring was to just throw people on the streets, but to create opportunities that can free money, that Uganda Post, as an example, could independently function its role, but then create other opportunities through multiple other agencies like MTN and all of these companies that we have in the sector. That way you do not have monopolies, but you have an open market that allows players to come and play. And as we all know, our telecom industry is really widely open, and there are various players. Now the question of whether we're getting efficiencies, whether the prices are affordable, and that's a different question. But at least what can I say, as a matter of fact, is that private sector is engaged. And we can mention that the same arrangement with the transport sector and so on. Now, there are, of course, downsides to these things. For example, in the transport sector, when it was opened up, before, I think Uganda had only 2 companies. Before that, it was 1 company. And then we had the Uganda Transport Company, and then Uganda, you had Uganda People's Transport Company. Apparently, Uganda Transport Company was the buses operating in the central and the west, Uganda People's Company covering the east, primarily the east, and I think part of the north. But you see, they were still cushioned and supported by resources from the center. They were not efficient enough. Actually, at one time, I'm advised that it was a cool thing for somebody to stand at the podium as a politician and promise a bus on a route going to the constituency as a vote-winning thing. You cannot say that today. Now, the downside would be, yes, so many people lost jobs, but I think the upside is that smaller indigenous transport companies like the Baganda Bus Company grew. It's actually no longer called the Baganda Bus Company. I don't know, I think somebody should do, I don't know, we'll talk to lawyers about it. but it's now, I think maybe, I don't know, but you know, it's all over the place. Gaga, Horizon, and all these players. So the bus company has grown. But because of that single action of restructuring and opening up UTC, you have more buses, you have a lot more matatus. By the way, matatus were never there, I don't know why, apart from and then you have more border borders, of course, as a result of a void that was created. And I can see the vice president shaking her head about border borders. But you see, it's not the management and the infrastructure that supports them. It's the opportunity that all of these people who looked to Uganda People's Company and UTC to be employed are now self-employed, and they're raiding border borders, and the youth are working out there. So these reforms can be expanded to as much as possible. Going into the financial sector, for example, there was liberalization, there was the foreign exchange, opening up of the foreign exchange. So all of these models worked, and of course people talk about privatization and the other areas where privatization, for purposes of clarity, was a lot more inclined on getting government good, placing it in the hands of the private sector. So you exit, allow the private sector to run it. And the experience is that every solution, every model serves a purpose in time when it's deployed. Probably the challenges are completely different, and hence the need for us to move forward. Now, one of the challenges that the initial models created was the one of infrastructure. We've just talked about the so many buses, narrower roads, zero infrastructure expansion. So the question is, how do you then get this infrastructure made? Do you still assign that to the private sector? No, infrastructure remains the responsibility of government. Service delivery, hospital, social services, housing, and so on is the responsibility of government. But through the newer models deployed at the start of the 2000s, you then readjust to meet the needs of today. The solutions we had in the earlier models I've talked about were the ones meant, they were suited for the needs of then, post-independence, right after independence and going into the 80s. But going forward into the 2000s, the newer challenges came. So you have opened up the sector, you have more players, but your infrastructure is not growing, and you do not have enough resources to fund that infrastructure. What do? You look at the private sector. Why? Because when you opened them up, you invited them in, they started making money, they have a lot of money. And this money is seated with them. As government, you have more competing and the other challenges that you have to meet. Hence, you look out for those gaps in your financing that you cannot meet on budget, and you invite in the private sector to meet them. Now, if we get that and realize that budget is constrained, budget is not sufficient, the needs are growing, but private sector has money, has expertise, and is innovating faster than public sector, then you've got to the gist of what PPPs are. PPPs are about inviting the private sector to work with you to do what you should have done, but you're not able to do because of budget constraints, because of innovation, because of speed. And you let the private sector do that with you. As opposed to the first one where you let the private sector do it alone, this time they do it with you. Why? Because the private sector is risk averse. They are not in for a joke. They are not politicking. They are in for a return. So if you guarantee that, you allocate risks to them, those risks that they can handle, and you take over risks you could handle, then you've sorted the whole issue of PPPs. So PPPs are purely that, and I'll go back to I'll then go back to the explanation, to the definition. PPPs were adopted as a strategy to fund the National Development Plan. Our plan, 5-year plan, and going forward into the mid-term and long-term, is built on a wish list. That wish list must be funded by budget. Budget is not sufficient, as I've said, and therefore the plan is to look for alternative financing modes. And these are so many, PPPs being one of them. We tap into those opportunities and we get the private sector to participate in them. So, having explained that, then I'll go to what actually PPPs are. As it were, PPPs are commercial transactions between the public entity and the private entity. What do we do when we engage in this kind of transaction? We allow the private sector to perform functions of the public sector. We allow the private sector to acquire property, for example, masts, repeater stations, and so on. Equipment, for example, you have a dam and you allow the private sector to operate it. Resources of the public sector, Serena Hotel is one of them, and you allow the private sector to engage, to run them on your behalf, to operate them, to maintain them. You allow the private sector to assume substantial risk for the project, and the private sector receives a benefit for performing that role. As simple as that. It's basically commercial, call it contract law. Yeah. That's it, and that's when lawyers really are in a driving seat on PPPs when it comes to public-private partnerships. Why do we think, therefore, that we could engage the private sector to do that as opposed to government doing it? Since we know the problem, why don't we as government do it? And I think the answer is simple. I think the private sector have, they can leverage innovation as it were. They have expertise, they're quick. The private sector moves quick to adapt some of these solutions, but they also have efficiencies that you do not necessarily find in the bureaucracy. That does not necessarily mean that government is sleeping. I should earn my pay here. Government is increasingly becoming efficient. I know so many lawyers who have left private law practice and come to government. I think I should brag about this. So I think we're really improving. But on the other side, we also recognize that the shift, the speed at which you do your things is easier, is faster. And that's something that you cannot necessarily degrade. We know that private sector has easy access to alternative financing for projects, whereas government is stuck into looking for concessional funds and loans and so on. Private sector have resources. You're now into fund management and pooling resources, syndication, and things that are not easy in government. We cannot, for example, as governments syndicate. We probably could. I don't actually know why we don't, but we probably do things differently. We governments, there's the constitution, and this is how things are supposed to be done. In private sector, there's innovation. You can quickly move around with your regulations as opposed to government. You have to go to parliament, and to go to parliament, you have to spend a lot of time getting the permissions. So alternative financing is easier for the private sector, and the lawyers are well grounded into making sure that they advise their clients to seek these alternative financing. Having said that, increasingly, with the permission of the moderator and the vice president, I see law firms evolving. A lot of them are law firms. I don't know whether I'm saying the right thing to this forum, but increasingly you see subunits that are inclining to business, to finance, to communication and other things, purely because the ecosystem in which you operate has grown beyond being ordinary legal advice. And I think that's the strength. Now, if we're going to talk about structuring, which we'll be discussing, and I know Nicholas has done a lot of this in the past, then the roles and these competences come in. It's not about law alone. It's also about the other competences that support your structuring of a good contract, a commercial contract. And these competences will speak to the capability for you to be able to advise your clients to find alternative financing, which financing is suitable for what, where can it be sourced, and how can it be contracted? And I think this is something that is of interest. Of recent, it's really growing as an interesting sector for most of the lawyers. What do we do in why we justify PPPs? We think about allocation of risks and the shift, the difference between that and what used to be in the past. In the past, government said, look, we are government, we have the money, budget. You want to do something, they craft a contract and hide it and say bid. Now that's a traditional procurement. So you bid, and after you've said everything, and at times you bring down your cost so much because you want to win the bid, and then you win it, and then somebody produces a contract, says sign on the dotted line. That was traditional contracting. and I think the world has shifted. The world needs to know, what is it that I'm signing up to? What is it that I'm committing resources for? What are my obligations? What are my responsibilities? What is it that you're bringing on the table? These are questions that most people who are engaged in the PPPs ask. So it's not good enough for you to have a contract or a deal and invite me as a lawyer, as my clients to come and invest. It's you being able to tell me exactly, just like we go to a doctor. You tell them what you wouldn't have told your parents that you have. You have to tell them because you want them to treat you. So in this case, risks that are allocated, we normally say they are allocated to the best party able to handle that risk. So do not ask a lawyer to go and, for example, undertake say removal of people from land. They can do it. Nicholas has done it for me before. But that's not the thing. He's going to charge you for that. If you can, as government, as a contracting authority, are able to give me vacant possession, then as a lawyer, I'm so eager to engage and I'll get my client to now do the infrastructure you want in a place that is available. So if that risk is best, the qualifier here is best placed, if that risk can be easily handled by government, then we allocate it to government. But then there are other things that lawyers can do or private parties can do. Those we allocate to the private party. For example, they can mobilize money quickly. They can innovate. They have expertise we probably don't have. We've been trying to think through getting people prepared for oil. You saw how fast government had now to send people on accelerated training to catch up, but the private people had already trained, and the majority of the players are coming from the private sector. So this tells you a story about risk and where you place it. But the most important thing with PPPs is that they take on board whole life costing approach. In other words, we are seated in a very beautiful building here at S&L. I know the partners and who put this together must have sat back and got these guys who designed and they paid them good sums of money to deliver the quality they have. I don't know, and this is a question I will leave with Nicholas, whether he built in operation and maintenance for the life of this building. And this is where all of us fail. Because this building, as long as Nicholas and team are able to make money, they will definitely maintain it. But what has failed government in the past is that we build very good infrastructure and we pay for it and we sit back and then it collapses around us. So you have things like Farmers House, decommissioned literally, it still houses the whole ministry. You have things like Uganda House, you have the new Twin Towers and Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Finance. All these are buildings that are seated on the books of the ministry to fork out. Now, one of the things when they are doing budgeting, and one of the things they may probably not fund, given the competing needs, COVID and others, is maintenance. Now, PPPs are structured the other way around. You make sure that from day one, as the building is being constructed, everybody who will have a role to play around that building is part of the team that delivers that infrastructure. So you're looking ahead, you're looking at maintenance going forward, and you build it in. So I would say, for purposes of example, the Uganda contracted money back in the days, and we got Serena Nile Hotel. They called it Nile Hotel. When Nile Hotel was built, it was just built and planted, just like all other hotels. We then realized we cannot run. We didn't have a 5-star hotel, so we called it a 5-star. And we needed somebody to do that. And we got in the private party. But the difference we did then within Serena, we asked the private party to ensure operation and maintenance. And we built in. So you're giving them management fees plus operation and maintenance going forward for the life of that hotel. That's why Serena looks the way it looks as compared to others. So the people who ensure that the deal happens guaranteed that by the time the operators of Serena leave, we will have a property as good as new because O&M is built. So Serena, they do not have to come back to government every year to compete for the little meager resources to maintain it. That's the closest I can get. But we're doing that with Kampala-Jinja Expressway. We're doing it with all other infrastructure we plan to deliver under the PPP model. So whole life costing is important and something that is quite new, and we believe is revolutionary in as far as the public sector is concerned, and it's going to add value to the way we contract. So what's the impact of PPPs? The increase in government stock of assets, and this will mean real assets, not assets which are just documented. Of course, we get financing, we get tax. PPPs will always, ideal PPPs will always ensure that they contribute to the economy. So we do a lot of assessment when we're doing the feasibility studies. You have things like economic impact assessment as a must. You have to demonstrate employment, so you're going to create and real employment, not numbers. We have a situation where one of the countries, I'm not at liberty to mention, adopted an empowerment program. And what they did was to say, look, as long as when you register a company, one of your shareholders has a stake in the company. So they would give them a nominal 1%. And they've beaten the law. And it was called black empowerment. So, and this is not what actually we mean with local content, the one Vice President spoke to. What we mean by local content under the PPP mode is real value, to ensure that a certain percentage, and we're working towards getting the law passed. But for us as a practice, as a unit, we ensure 30% in real terms is built into the structure. For example, we do not want to see you come and bid and present a bid where you're saying, oh, we have local content because somebody is going to produce, to bring trucks for feeding sand. We really mean real money, not 30%. So this, but also we realize that there are challenges with the local content. Now to speak of what we are pushing. The challenges are that we are not organized, and this is where lawyers again will have to help us play a role. Basic things that get the private sector organized, such as getting them to file returns, to have books of accounts, to be corporate entities, to be registered, to, things that make our private sector formal. These are things that you do not have. I was growing up and I knew that there was somebody called Chapambalas existed. So every time it's basically BAM, paying BAM. So every time you had something, they said Chapambalas. So you used to get that and you are okay. And then I start training people about business. And I asked them whether they can actually give me a list of 10 indigenous companies that existed maybe 50 years ago. And none of the people in that room could name Chapambalas. And then I realized, wait a moment, they actually know Tiger brand. Is it Tiger brand? The thing you find in the saunas. And that's a Chinese thing. But our Chapambalas was the same thing. Now what happened is that Chapambalas was somebody, an individual family, moving around in the neighborhood selling that balm. But they were not, and they were not encouraged to organize themselves, brand, have an identity, reach out and grow. So that's what's happening with our private sector. We have had situations where people have said, PPPs, you're not allowing the private sector to participate. And we said, wait a moment, we invite you in. But at times we hear stories, more stories and complaints than real proposals. We have a road that is $1.05 billion coming, Kampala-Jinja Expressway. They are going to construct that expressway. They are not going to ship in rock. They are not going to ship in all the vehicles. at least the specialized ones. But you know, the usual transport, they are not going to, you know, to fabrication and all these things that support the infrastructure. And ask myself, which Uganda is ready to mobilize 50 trucks, 50 maguru kumi, to use the word, and make them available to tap into the $1.5 billion when we eventually sign that deal? And frankly, I've been asking that question. I've never got a single name. What does that mean? There are more than 50 trucks in Kampala. We see them all over the sites, but that they are organized to be able to tap into these opportunities, and it is not possible. Now, the weakness of not having our private sector organized is that when these bids are being prepared and the competition comes and somebody has borrowed money and he has to perform on time, on budget, they are not going to wait for you. They are going to go look for that Kenyan who can bring in 50 trucks. After all, we're in East Africa. So we need not miss on the opportunities that PPPs bring, but I think we need to look inwards and try to organize ourselves and to be able to tap into the resources. Okay, so we believe that PPPs contribute to macroeconomic efficiency, locative efficiency. In other words, you ease pressure on the budget. I've already talked about that. When you free the resources, the budget is competed for by so many priorities. If you organize and take away and deploy PPPs, you're letting the budget breathe. You're getting some people. For example, again, I'll use this infrastructure where we are. If we needed 500 million to deliver this infrastructure, but we use the public-private partnerships, we still get the infrastructure today, but probably start paying 5 years' time when the infrastructure has been built. So what you've done over a period of 0 to 5 years, you've allowed your budget to do other things. You still know that you'll pay at year 5, and you plan for that. But at least for year 1 to 5, you are a bit free to do the things you have to do to meet the needs of education and others. So that comes from the allocative efficiency that we're talking about. Distributive efficiency, again, you improve service delivery. You allow means of works to do other roads, UNRWA to do other roads, as the private sector is doing Kampala GD Expressway. You spread over. Private sector efficiency for productive efficiency. Again, we've seen that the private sector tends to think beyond the faster. Again, they're looking for opportunities all the time. I'll give an example, and I know Nicholas is going to really get me on this one. Back in the days, not Nicholas, but somebody else, contracted MTN, the second national operator license. And the second national operator license was basically to allow another operator to come into Uganda and give telecom services. The contract that was written then was written with the structure of UPTC in our minds. For example, you had the lines. By then, there were these lines which ran over wooden poles. So because we are coming from a zero, one line was being shared by 6 people, 1 to 6 in the country. So for somebody to say, you are going to roll out 50,000 lines was so huge a jump that we believe that the private sector would not perform. And of course, the smart lawyers like all of these people on the forum, they negotiated the contract and signed on the dotted line, 50,000, we shall roll out that. And what did they do? They just deployed microwave. And they delivered beyond the 50. Actually, they shocked themselves because Ugandans took to cellular phones so quickly. So the technology had moved. So efficiency has changed. And you know, we're still stuck in the lines. We're thinking, no, we'll wait for poles. No, they just put the communications gadgets, microwave, and eventually the rest is history. Uganda gave birth to MTN in Nigeria. And so on. So their entry in Uganda opened up everywhere else. So those are some of the things that they look like ordinary statements, but they mean a lot. Employment, skills transfer, these are ordinary words that we tend to use, but PPPs will also still believe in equality. Quality of employment, quality of the skill that you're transferring, and that is a detail. It's a detail from the perspective of most people who have been undertaken or taken on under PPPs do not just get a job, but they get a lot more. And I would default to MTN. The same engineers who used to be in Uganda Post and Telecommunications were actually picked by MTN. But what they did, they took them away to some other land and sort of wiped off the dust and remunerated them a little higher and gave them powers, tools to operate. So you saw the double cabins, you saw all of this in the new culture about MTN. It was empowering. Now some of these things speak to employment and the quality of employment. And all of a sudden, the subdued professionalism that they had because they were less paid, they were demotivated, kicked in. And these companies took off. They never shipped in people. They had managers, fine, but most of these were Ugandans. The young people who have turned around in these companies are Ugandans, graduates from Makerere. So we believe that when you allow the private sector to play a role and enable them and facilitate them like we did in those transactions that I've mentioned, you then get the efficiencies that we're talking about. And of course, ultimately, private sector-led economy, as it were, and that's the ultimate goal. That's the government objective. I'll try and move through these quickly. So where are we now? Of course, National Development Plan 3 and going into the new one, we adopted and agreed to use PPPs as a strategy to encourage private sector to develop particular infrastructure and the services. And because of that, the policy was passed in 2010, and we are aware that we're talking to lawyers, so we'll let you read all of these. They are available, they are public documents. The law was enacted in 2015, the regulations in 2019, and the guidelines, which of course give detail and functionalize, operationalize the regulations and part of the act in 2020. So structurally, we are governed by, I would call it a board, although we call it a committee, and the Public-Private Partnerships Committee. This was established in accordance with the Act. It gives oversight and it comprises both public and private sector officers. I would call them personalities. And it's chaired by PSST. The reason for the structure, and I believe this is being shared, the reason for this structure is purely to make sure that we do not then we meet the private sector halfway. It's still called public-private partnerships. So we believe that in government, you run around trying to find the offices. You run around trying to find the resources. In the PPP side, we believe that we needed to have a one-stop center for all of these decisions. So that explains the first set of the public officers. They're part of the board. They represent those interests, but they sit together and make decisions. So you're not going to submit a bid to us, and then we tell you, you go to Ministry of Land, sort out this, go to National Planning Authority, sort out this. No, everything is done in one room. So that was one way of trying to get efficiencies. We also have representation from academia. By then, the framers of the law believed that because it was a new thing, and we probably needed an academia there, and Parliament, you lawyers have your ways when you're legislating. Most of them are lawyers. so that was a decision, and yes, we have the academia represented, but we also thought, as I said at the beginning, the PPPs lean a lot more on law and legal issues, and therefore the inclusion of a judge who has no interest anywhere but he's been a judge, proven a judge, and we are really happy to have a retired judge sitting on the committee. And of course, I serve on the committee as a member, and also the secretary to that committee. So that is the structure of the PCC. And of course, below the PCC, we have the PPU, which I head. The PPU is the secretariat, the technical arm of the PCC. We do all the validation, the screening, the regulatory work, and then we prepare documents and the paperwork. We also handhold institutions of government. It's true that there's still growth that we must register, and that MDAs, ministries, departments, and including local governments are not really grounded into PPPs yet. So what we've done, we've grown in the institution in such a way that we have expertise in there. We have engineers, we have lawyers, we have financial analysts, we have modulars. Everybody is, trying, and economists, of course, to try and handhold entities to make sure that we deliver or even assess proposals to deliver them to the market. So what you have there is the ecosystem that supports and all relates to the PPP, the contracting authorities. Maybe what I've noticed explained is SG still sits on the PPP committee, but we also report to them. We have to make sure that all these contracts are approved as required. Auditor General will audit contracts as soon as we sign, but they also require to audit our own processes. We'll be talking about somebody called a process auditor, who is quite different from the Auditor General at a later stage, but that one goes through every stage. Experience taught us that when you do a deal, you've spent 5 years, you've engaged the private sector, you've engaged so many lawyers. Private sector will deploy quality lawyers, because they have the resources. You've also hired transaction advisors who are lawyers, and you've done a deal for 3 years. Most of these PPPs take between 1 to 3 years to really mature to financial close. And then all of a sudden, you present these contracts to, say, Parliament, and they say no. Just because somebody has just read one line without, realizing where it's coming from. We realize that could be a problem going forward, and it's so frustrating for the private sector, because the Parliament governs government, and of course, yes, governs the country, but when it comes to deals, the private sector is chasing after time and money. So what we did, we embedded into our processes what the person we call a process auditor is independent, but what he does, he is basically the one who is a traffic officer. You will check every step as you move, and you keep reporting, and that way we make sure that we avoid all pitfalls that in the past characterized deals of this nature. Okay, so what does the government expect when they engage in the PPPs, and what does the private sector expect? As I said, efficiencies, on time, on budget, innovation. We supplement government resources with private sector funding, provide better value for money. This is important. It's not semantics, it's not just a terminology. It's a real science. Again, we have to make sure that proof is given for value for money. And then, of course, improved access and service delivery. What does the private sector say? I said at one point that it's not a cup of tea, it's not free, it's not a free lunch. They expect business, and a viable business at that. They expect fair distribution of risk and responsibility. We've talked about open accounting, legal contracting, if I can use the two words interchangeably. Transparency in procurement. Again, going forward, you're going to learn that in PPPs, we do not produce a contract on the day so that you sign on the dotted line. We actually give you the contract as we contract, as we engage in the tender, a bid, so that you mark it up. You go through the legal markups and so on. So that's a problem we've had. Most of the traditional people have been in this business, not in Nicholas. They've said, well, you guys, you leaked. They call it leaking. You leaked the contract.
But to everybody.
Yeah, to everybody. But what we actually do, as long as you've gone through the RFP stage, the RFP is issued with a draft contract. Yeah. So you have the document, and you're free to mark it up. We sit, we negotiate, and by the time we sign, we are signing on an agreed position that we all believe must be delivered. Consistency in legal and regulatory framework. Of course, you don't, as the private sector, they don't expect us as government to change. Today we've contracted along with these parameters. Tomorrow there's a shock into the system, either new law or an unexpected. Of course, we know that some of these are business risks that you take, but we need to be consistent as we do certain things. And of course, the support of the courts in case it really goes south and you have to go to courts. And we're happy that I think you guys pushed for the commercial court, and we believe it has helped us to move move to resolve issues faster. Stable political and economic environment, and I think 30 plus years, Uganda has now a good story to tell, and investors look to that. Of course, we can still shout about our internal politics, but at least the period speaks volumes to investors. That long length of stability is important. The last one I'll put it there, I am not qualified, but this is one of the things that the private sector expects. And I will ask Nicholas to speak to that, although it's my slide, because I don't want to get lawyers coming after me, but, but that was why we put it in red. I know you are best qualified, and all of you forum members, your ULC members, you are better qualified to speak to that. So, PPPs and public procurements. What are the characteristics of public procurements and PPPs? In public procurement, you procure assets. In the PPPs, you procure a service. Let me break down that so that we get to know exactly what this means. When you're contracting under public procurement, it's the traditional contracts you've got. So somebody will come and say, oh, we need a building, this very building. And I have my 500 million, as I said at the beginning, and all I need is a contractor, local. So they will build it for you, and you have your building. So you've procured the asset. On the PPP side, remember I talked about life cycle costing. So from the word go, you would want to know, will that building be functional? If I need to have a meeting like this, training like this, will I have the capabilities to train? Will the lighting work? Will the seats be available? How about the AC? Will I have the AC throughout the life of the building working at 22 degrees centigrade? Or will it all of a sudden jump, and who will be responsible for that? Supposing I want this replaced, supposing we have the other one which needs to be, shall we wait for budget for it to be? So you buy functionality. A hotel room may still be a room in the hotel, but when it's not functional, it's not available. So you don't pay for it. If Nicholas had consulted me before they built this one, I would have made sure that the functionality of this new building is retained for 50 years. In other words, he shouldn't be looking over his shoulder to make sure that the lift is working. The supplier of the lift would be embedded in the contract to make sure that for 50 years, the parts, the repair, the maintenance is part of the contract. That's what we call functionality. That's what we call a service. We do not get the building, but we get the services that the building offers. In modern contracting, again, people will say, look, all I need is a conference facility or a room where I can do this kind of meeting. You do not prescribe whether it will be on the ground floor or the top floor. You just need, you prescribe the facility, what it should be able to deliver. And that's what you contract. And that's the difference between traditional procurement and what we normally do under PPDA and the PPPs. Project management, I'm not going to run through these, we'll make them available, but I'm just picking a few so that we highlight them. When you procure the building, like Minister of Works, Minister of Works is responsible for maintaining and managing the contract. When you do it the PPP route, the private sector takes overall project management, they design. In the traditional procurement, you design, in other words, you're inheriting design risk. Yeah. On the PPP side, we make design part of the risk of the private party. So if anything happens and is established to have been a design flaw, then that is assigned to the private sector. That way, we will solve and resolve the issues. Of course, we talked about risk financing, and we talked about risk sharing and so on. These we'll read for ourselves. The contractor arrangement maybe is the one I should talk to, is under public-private PPDA. It's a short term. Build a building, go away. Build a road and get out. They are eager to do that and they get out. The PPP side is long term. You are in there 25 years, 30 years, depending on the infrastructure that you're delivering. So you're required to make sure that you deliver it and you stay in there. Now what that does is actually shifted the risks. In other words, if somebody knows that I'm going to maintain this road for 25 years, they're not going to do a short job.
No.
You don't even have to have an engineer who certifies every, they do what, kilometer? Kilometer. You don't have to. Because the money is in there for 25 years, anything that fails, they are responsible for it. But you have to monitor the contract and make sure that it performs. And again, we are not going through the structuring. There are a lot more detailed things like how do you then report the flaws, who is responsible. There's something called an output specifications as part of the contracts. These give you the detail of what is going to be produced, and they also give you the details as a lawyer for what to look out for as your project managing, and when to charge what and when not to charge what, and when to be responsible for the penalties as well. So that particular, the contractual elements that are in PPPs will give you a lot of legal work to do when you are structuring the deal, because it borders on what you take home eventually for your client. So the myths and concerns, again, a lot of things to go through here, but I would really pray that we share this. What I want to talk to, and I'm going to pick this purely because of Kampala Entebbe Expressway. For example, they say when you bring in private sector into PPPs, you increase tariff. And our response is not necessarily, because at times it depends on a lot more that you're building in and that you require. All of a sudden, people are now getting used to paying 5,000 at every toll on Kampala Entebbe Expressway. And that doesn't mean you're paying more just because a private sector was invited to do that. But you're paying the 5,000 because you need the comfort of moving fast on a good road to reach Entebbe to do your business. Secondly, that does not replace the alternate roads that you have that go to Entebbe. So some of these things which I wouldn't want to go in because of time, we'll just leave them so that we move on to the next. We'll leave them with you. And I think for me, this brings me to that point where wish, with your permission, to invite my colleague to take on to the next part of PPPs. But what I wanted to say, and I want to leave with the audience, is that PPPs are a fertile ground for legal practice. We note that in Uganda, increasingly, we've seen people and lawyers coming into what they call commercial law, and I'm careful with the way I'm using these words. But then on the PPP side, it's more than writing a contract where somebody is selling something, or somebody is acquiring something, or somebody is buying into something.
Sure. You're
getting into a sphere where you have to be aware of what you're doing now going into 20, 30 years time.
Sure.
And the depth of research, the depth of considerations, the depth of risks, assumptions that you make as you advise your contracts will have to be that long and yet so timely, because you need a deal signed today. And that's something I cannot explain, and that's probably why you have Uganda Law Society, and you have people like Nicholas and others who have been into this and done it, that probably we need to tap into and see how we can grow this. The beautiful thing is that internationally, there are so many big law firms that have been at this for some time. And probably, again, using the resource you have at Uganda Law Society, you may look for these international practitioners, and they help expand this message and the training. But we need Ugandan lawyers to actually play in this space. We have noted that those who have tendered in PPP projects tend to come as international law firms, and the kind of work that is assigned to the local law firms, apart from a few you can name on one hand, are getting just ordinary work. things like, checking records of Uganda Registration Services Bureau, checking for, records and things like that. But we're thinking structurally, we are thinking we need to get into the depth of PPP, real PPP. And that will come with a commitment that I believe that you should be able to make. And we are grateful that this opportunity avails us the chance to speak to you about it. So I request my colleague, Mr. Orono Otweyo, with your permission, to come through and proceed with the next part.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jim. Unfortunately, we are online, so I'm not sure that people can clap for you, but the Vice President has clapped on our behalf as Uganda Law Society. But this is extremely informative. I know that colleagues will be, talking away quite a lot of things. We will have a Q&A with you at some point before you leave. So we're just going to ask that you stay with us. Kill the day, hang with lawyers. It's a good crowd to be around.
You can't avoid it.
Yeah, and just as you were saying, some of the things are 25, 30 years. I worked on transactions which at 25, 30 years, I've done 21 years on the bar, and I keep, looking out to see whether things will falter. I'm glad that none has fallen through the cracks yet, so, we just thank God for that. But thank you very much. We'll ask Mr. Otweyo Orono to now join us and take the second part of the presentation. Thank you, Jim. And colleagues, lawyers, kindly just note down your questions. At some point in time, we'll find a way of having our technical staff filter them through for us. We will probably balkanize them and then take them in lots so that we can save a bit of time. But yes, we would want to try and use the time that these gentlemen have here to be able to take as much as we can from them. Jim, can you just help us with the gadget for something? It's my pleasure now to introduce to you Mr. Orono Otweyo. Mr. Orono Otweyo is a principal technical advisor with the PPP unit in the Ministry of Finance. He's proudly Ugandan. I've worked with him, taken benefit of learning a lot on PPPs from him. He's done PPPs in Uganda and in Southern Africa and many other areas. And we are glad to have him this morning. He works with Mr. Mugunga, who's just spoken with us, to us. And Mr. Otweyo Orono is going to be taking us through the second part of this, around about the processes for national projects, and then for also the local government projects. People would want to know the thresholds. Can I take a deal which is $500,000 or 1 billion to the unit? And would that qualify for the kind of resources that you require to be able to do a PPP? So we'll hand it over to you at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Jim. The Vice President has just left. And thank you, colleagues. I was about to say colleagues. I'm not a lawyer, so
will not be held against you.
Yeah, thank you. PPPs, as the executive director has just given us a brief highlight. Essentially, we are saying we need the private sector to work with government and provide the services that government is supposed to be providing. Now, what we have been witnessing, not just here in Uganda, but around the countries that have been, the challenges where the private sector, they have the money, the money is itching them to invest, and then they come and tell government, we want to do this project, and sometimes find that government is not ready. So what the Act has provided is that we need government to arrange for those projects to be ready before we can engage with the private sector, because as Jim told us, it is important that we identify the risks and then give the risks to the party that is best and the best position to manage those risks. And you cannot identify those risks unless you have gone through a process of preparing that project and knowing exactly what the obligations of the parties are supposed to be. So what I'm going to go through with you is essentially just the process that government has to go through, and also to go through the process where in those few cases that the private sector has money and government is not ready, what we call unsolicited proposals, how they can be handled. Now, the first phase, what we may call the first phase, is project inception. How is a project selected, and how do we know that this project is suitable for PPPs, and what do we go through? And that phase essentially is government to say during the planning process. For us here in Uganda, we have what we call the National Development Planning Process. I think most countries go through the same process. And this is a consultative process. Now, recently the parish development model was launched. And essentially the objective of that model is to say, how can we ensure that the services go up to the level of the parish or the common man, the ordinary man in the village. So when we are developing, when we are planning for those projects, we have that in mind to say these projects are not developed by the government officials at their desks, but should be through a consultative process, and that's where the NDP comes in. And in the NDP, both at the national level and at the local level, local government level, once we have identified the projects, then say, is it going to be funded by government? Is there sufficient funds in government? So we arrive at a situation where we call unfunded and funded projects. And essentially the funded projects, the expectation is that government will provide funds either from the national budget or through the revenues that we generate from the taxes, or development partners like the loans and the grants, and some other alternative means of financing that will be available to government. And then if you look at the National Development Plan, you'll find there is a section where the expectation is that these projects will be funded by the private sector. And in the first slide, you'll realize that what we call a funding gap of more than $1.4 billion is required per year. That's per year in our case. So the expectation is that 1.5, is it 1.4 billion? Yeah, $1.4 billion per year is supposed to come from the private sector. And the expectation that is supposed to come through public-private partnership. And that's for national projects. Now for the local government projects, it should be almost about the same level, because we have more than 135 local government local government authorities. So essentially we are saying on average we need about $3 billion every year to deliver services, in addition to the ones that have been provided by government. So we have to go through that process and say which ones, how do we identify those projects. So essentially in the project selection, first is we have to make sure that the objectives of the NDP are fulfilled, are satisfied. And then the projects, like the private sector says they need an acceptable project, bankable project, they have to be feasible. So we do what we call a project pre-feasibility assessment, where we say what are the needs, what are the options that we are going to use for delivering this, what are the costs and cost-benefit analysis to determine if it is actually feasible. So once we have gone through this, we come up with what we call a concept note. Now the concept note essentially is for purposes of now formalizing that project in government, to say that as a government department, as a government ministry, as a local authority, we have undertaken the assessment of the needs. We know that this is a need that is required, the assessment of the kind of infrastructure required to provide that need, and then the costs involved, and we are almost sure and confident that we can get the private sector to invest in this, to provide money to participate together with the government to deliver that service. And once the government department has put that in place, it submits that to the PPP unit for the committee to make the judgment, the determination that actually that project is viable and is suitable for implementation as a PPP. Now that's the first phase. Once the committee has looked at it, then the project is registered. We have a register of public-private partnership projects. And right now, as I'll go through with you, we have more than 30 projects that are in our pipeline. That those are opportunities that are available for the private sector to participate in government. Now, once that project has been cleared by the PPP committee, then the expectation, the requirement according to the law, the PPP Act, is that the contracting authority here meaning the government department or the ministry or the agency, the local government, then appoints a team to implement that project now as a PPP. And normally what we do, the challenge we have in government is project management. So the expectation is that this project team will be tasked with managing that project from that stage up to this time when the financial close, or when the private sector has put in the money and we have broken the ground and the project has been transferred to the private sector. That team is then what we call the project team, and definitely that team is headed by the project officer, and that's where the process auditor comes in. The role of the process auditor is very, very important. Essentially, the process auditor is from day one is going to be like an internal auditor for the project, for that project, and what he's going to do is what the Act says the contracting authority must do is going to check and make sure that the contracting authority has done. And the contract, and I can't refer to the Act, but the Act says that before the accounting officer signs the contract, the process auditor is supposed to give him a report that satisfies, that confirms that all the processes set out in the Act have been followed by the project team. Now, I think the framers of the Act just wanted to make sure that by the time government engages or contracts with the private party, all the boxes have been ticked, so that we are, at the end of the day, we are getting value for money for that project, and no shortcuts have been done. And even if there is a query at any stage, the contracting authority is confident that they have done what they have done to their level best. And that's where we now come to the role of the transaction advisor. Now, the expectation, as part of the project preparation, there are several studies that are supposed to be done. The preparation of the relevant documents for tendering, the preparation of the contract documents and all that. Now, it is not common to get all that expertise in a government department or ministry. I'm still on that. Okay. So it is not common that we get all this expertise in a government department. So what the law says is that where the department or the contracting authority in this case does not have that expertise, they may use what they call a transaction advisor. And the transaction advisor is just a consortium of experts, of the lawyers, of the technical people, the engineers, the environmental experts, sector experts, who will then come together and support the government department to prepare the document from the studies up to the negotiations, contract signing, and ensuring that the project actually kicks off. So now that is the transaction advisor, and this is where the lawyers, not just lawyers, but all the experts come in to say this is an opportunity for, let's say, for Ugandans to say what opportunities do we have, and what role do we play. So for the lawyers, since this is the forum for lawyers, we will now be going to look back and say, okay, on the pipeline that I will be sharing with you. Say if we get one project like KCCA, they have a project. What role can I as a lawyer play in that project? And how do I come in? And where do I come in? At what point do I come in? So that we now start readying ourselves, because these are opportunities that the PPP opportunities that will be coming. So that you start, if there is need for you to develop the capacity, the relevant capacity to participate in that as a transaction advisor, as a lawyer, as a legal expert in that team, then you can come in. So that is an opportunity that I think Nicholas will talk to you about that, to say what are the various opportunities that we have. And then once we have registered the project, now we as part of the project development, one of the activities is the feasibility study. And now that's where also we have a challenge in the sense that feasibility studies, while it is not all that complicated, from the various studies that we have that have been submitted to us, they are not all that they are not all that detailed. I mean, good. I mean, how can I say? They don't compare to international best practice, and that's where we also need to go back and say, when we talk about feasibility study, what do we mean? Fortunately, the Act has given us, I think it's quite elaborate on what feasibility study is. So the first point of reference would be in the Act to say, and the Act has been very, very descriptive. Is it descriptive or prescriptive?
Descriptive.
Descriptive. It has been very, very descriptive to say the feasibility study must contain that and this and that, and even the form and in the procedures, in the guidelines, we've even given the format of the feasibility study, because what we have appreciated is that we don't have the capacity. So what we need to do is, based on international best practice, what should be in the feasibility study, what kind of information do we need to put in the feasibility study. So that is in the guidelines. So all you need to do is download that and just essentially fill in, and you'll have a complete feasibility study. So the ministries and the government agencies are supposed to carry out that feasibility study and then submit to the unit. Now this feasibility study includes the draft procurement documents, and the procurement documents are essentially what's called the request for qualification, or EOI in the language of the PPDA. Then we have the request for proposal, that is the second stage of the tendering process, and then the draft tender, the draft agreements. As Mr. Mgunga informed you, we need transparency in all these processes, and there's nothing more transparent than giving you the draft contract and saying, this is the contract from my perspective that we are going to enter into. Tell me what you want to add it, or tell what you want removed, so that you can negotiate. So once that is all done, put together, we then go to the committee and say, this is the project is viable. The unit does an assessment to determine whether it is viable, it is affordable, there is value for money, and there is appropriate risk transfer. All these are set out in the PPP Act. Once that is done, then the committee approves that document, and then we go to a procurement. Now, procurement, we're familiar with procurement according to PPDA. Now, this procurement is outside the PPDA process. I think it's very, very important that we appreciate that this procurement is outside the PPDA process. PPDA Act, is that what it is?
Yeah.
PPDA Act, or PPD Act does not have jurisdiction, you'll excuse me if I'm using that, does not have jurisdiction on PPP procurement. The procurement of the PPP procurement is the responsibility of the accounting officer. So what the Act says is that the accounting officer, when it comes to PPP procurement, is supposed to appoint an evaluation committee. Now, the evaluation committee is the one then who assesses the tenders as they come in, and then advises the accounting officer on the the bidders who qualify and on the pre-qualified bidders. And then the evaluation committee is supposed to report to the PPP committee. Now that's what the act says. So while we have a PPDA procurement process, there is a parallel process for PPP procurement. Now this process is different in the sense that we are not procuring a good, we are not procuring a service, we are not procuring a supply as defined under the PPDA Act. And that's where the difference is. We are procuring a private party to come and provide a service, a facility plus a service for the term of the contract, which is in most cases long term, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. So that's the difference. I think it's very important that we get that. And in the principle is that they need to have a competitive tender process, transparent, fair. So that is the procurement process. So the procurement process is either we can adopt, when first it's competitive, then we have as one of the methods to use is open tender, then there's what we call the selective tender, then there's a direct procurement, and the direct procurement is supposed to be approved by cabinet. So a contracting office authority cannot go out and pick one person unless cabinet has approved that contracting authority can use that method, and that's clearly specified in the Act. Now the process is similar to the PPDA one. So they have to get, once the evaluation committee has evaluated the bids and they have identified a person, then we go through contract negotiations, which is a normal process, and that's where again there's need for the legal experts to support government entity, and at the same time the legal expert will support the private sector on the other side. So that is also an opportunity that we have for the lawyers. And once that is done, then it is submitted again. The contract, subject to the threshold that is going to be determined by cabinet, is submitted. If the project is beyond the threshold that is determined, then they have to submit to cabinet to approve that project before it can be signed. And obviously, as a government entity, the contract has to be cleared by the Solicitor General. So that is now the approvals of the feasibility studies, and then once the negotiations have taken place, the contracts have been cleared, the project has been cleared by cabinet, the contract has been cleared by Solicitor General, then the agreement can be signed by the contracting authority. Now the project implementation is like any other project. There is the mobilization, and then there is definitely the construction, and then the operations, and then the most important, I think, which I just need to point out here, is exit and transfer. Now, for most of our projects, we don't anticipate that there is going to come an end of that project. Now, in the PPP, as my colleague said earlier, we take a life cycle approach to the implementation to say at what stage and at what time is what activity going to take place. So, in fact, as one of the clauses in the contract is going to be what we call the transfer back, the handback provisions, which is going to say, for example, 2 years before the contract is ended, we need to have a survey in terms of to find out what's the state of the assets, what's required to be renovated, to bring it back to a level where when it is transferred back to government, it will continue to provide the services. So 2 years before that, then possibly 6 months we have to do evaluation, then at the end of all those. Now that is very, very important that we need to include it in the processes and in the contracts. Now the what unsolicited proposals, it's normally a very big problem for us. I know as lawyers, they're very active in this area, and I don't fault them because they're looking out for their clients, and it's oftentimes you get clients who have the money and they say we want opportunities, and then you get to know who is who in which department and which government, and then you say, by the way, I have 100 million, I want this to do this bridge. Now, as far as we are concerned, if it is a PPP, that is an unsolicited proposal. And the process, we are not discouraging, the Act does not discourage unsolicited proposal, but provides a process to how it should be handled. And as a lawyer, you need to go and look at the Act so that you can advise your clients. Because we have so many, these one-page letters, and sometimes they even go and end up with the blue letters, and it puts us in a very difficult situation. So first is that this process, this proposal must be independently originated. Meaning, your client must not have seen a government official who then leaks to him what the ministry intends to do, and then they pass behind the ministry and say, oh, by the way, we have the money, we can do this project. So it must be independently generated. So the private sector must think using that innovation to say, oh, by the way, I want a flyover from Kololo Hill to wherever. It's independent. It's not in the government processes, in projects. And then the preparation of that project, the requirement of the Act is that the private party must prepare a feasibility study. And that feasibility study must satisfy the requirements in the Act. The PP Act Section 22 provides what must be in the feasibility study. So the feasibility study that the private sector submits as part of the unsolicited proposal must meet all those requirements in that Act. So go and look at that so that when someone with the money comes, you say, hey, by the way, do you have a feasibility study? Then you can submit to the relevant ministry. And once you have submitted to the relevant ministry, the Act says it must be subjected to a competitive bidding process. So what is going to happen is, if you have a project, for example, you say, I want to build a dam or whatever, then you submit to the relevant ministry, then the ministry will have to review, and then if it meets the requirements and the requirements of the Act, then they submit to the PPP unit and the PPP committee. Once it's approved, then they're supposed to go through a tender process. To say, thank you for submitting this unsolicited proposal, but we have to go out there and find out, is there any other investor who can do this, who can provide this same service at the same price or better price? So that's the requirement of the unsolicited proposals. Now, when we come to local governments, local governments, we appreciate, first, there are very many, more than 135 units. So we have the Act is for the whole country. The assumption is that it applies to the local governments. The challenge is that the local governments, their projects in terms of size and complexity is slightly smaller than the national projects. So we are saying, how do we adapt? Still adapt, we have to apply the Act to the local governments, but we want to adapt them to their conditions, their kind of projects. So what we are doing now is that we are working with the local governments to come up with some kind of guideline to say, while the Act says this, to ensure that you still satisfy the Act, however, in terms of processes, let us do 1, 2, 3, 4, which is slightly more simplified version of the guidelines. And also we're working with them to say, now, given that these are your projects and they're relatively small, what kind of threshold? So that if a project is X amount, how should it be treated? It's still a PPP, yes. It still has to follow the Act, yes. To be in line with the Act, yes. But how do we treat them? So now that is what we're working on now, and once that is done, cabinet is going to set that threshold, and then the minister will publish it as a statutory instrument, and then so that we now know from X amount this is how it is going to be treated, from Y amount this is how it's going to be treated, especially to ensure that the local government projects are also fall within the act. And also together with the local governments, we are right now in the process of identifying with the local governments which of their projects are suitable. And so far, we have identified almost more than 100 projects. And that once those lists are ready, we shall then publish them and then start engaging and seeing how can we support the local governments the private sector, provide services at the grassroots. Now, in terms of projects that are available, this is this pipeline is in our website. So I would encourage you to go to the website. Then you find out this list is already there in the website. Just one or two which is not in that list, and that is the National Information Technology, the NITA-U project. But NITA-U project already is quite advanced. The Ministry of Trade project, the head office is not there, and then the
Coffee?
Yeah, you see the Uganda Coffee Development Authority, also they need a head office, which is also not there in that list. Otherwise, the list that's just a list. But just to point out the key ones that are in that list, one is the Kampala Jinja Road. Right now, where we are in the RFP stage. We have already pre-qualified the bidders, and we are now going to the next stage, which is trying to firm up the tender documents so that they can then submit the request for proposals sometime this year, and hopefully subject to how we can finalize how soon we can finalize the competitive negotiations with them. We should be able to sign. Hopefully, the next financial year we should be able to sign up the agreement. Now, this list, and then another one which is not in that list is the Bustema University. They have a multi-purpose business complex that they want to set up. That one has also been registered. Essentially, Bustema is somewhere in Tororo. For those of you who may not be knowing where Tororo is, in the east. So the Bustema University. That's where Nicholas comes from.
That's where I was born.
So they have it is a university. The challenge they have is they don't have student accommodation. It's just somewhere along the road, and there's no shopping facilities. So they're saying, can we develop? It is actually in between Tororo district and Busia district, and saying, can we provide some kind of business complex so that it can support the university? Then we have definitely we have Soroti University. We have Lira, those projects. We have Mbarara. We have Jinja. All those, but those projects are coming up. Once we have confirmed them, we shall put them in the register, and then so that you get to know what the opportunities are there. Otherwise, for now, that is essentially what I can tell you about this. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Orono Otweyo, whom I also know comes from the Tororo side of things. But thank you very much to you and to Mr. Jim Mugunga for sharing, these insights with us. It makes a difference, certainly, when the people who are in charge of things come and talk to us as lawyers about, what we need to do to be able to ready ourselves. I can tell you probably a lot of people started in the morning, without knowing exactly, how rigorous this process may be. We will leave this place a lot better equipped and a lot more enlightened, and probably even hungry for more information. So I am hoping that, this dialogue this morning will also encourage people to come out and actually take interest in what you do. Pay a visit to the Ministry of Finance, to the PPP unit. It's a public office. Nobody will, stop you from going there as long as you make, appropriate arrangements. So yes, we will certainly be, be following through on that. Ladies and gentlemen, I know that we've been seated in one place for a bit of a while. It's almost 2 hours now. I was just proposing that probably we take a a 5-minute health break. Have people in their offices or homes or wherever they're taking the calls from, to just grab a cup of tea or just take a health break, and then we can reconvene at exactly 11. We will be taking you through, the last segment of our presentations, which will be done by one of my colleagues in the farm here, whom I'll introduce to you at that point. And then we will leave a little bit of time, fairly good time, to be able to deal with the questions that we've seen on the screen, which we certainly have every interest in dealing with. We want to be able to live here with people equipped with the kind of information they would require. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Just give us 5 minutes. I'll ask the technical team to keep us busy as we wait for the 5 minutes, and as my colleague takes a deep breath before he takes on the stage as well. Thank you very much. Okay. You can stretch a bit at least. Yeah. This edge. Okay, good morning once again, and welcome back to this second segment of this session. I know for those who have just joined us, we are talking PPPs today, continuing legal education organized by Uganda Law Society. And we just had a presentation from the Executive Director of the PPP unit in the Ministry of Finance, Mr. Jim Mugunga, and his colleague, Mr. Rono Tweyo, who is the Principal Technical Advisor of the PPP unit in the same ministry. We are now going to the segment that I think that all of us would be interested in, and which is the segment that talks about what opportunities are there for lawyers. How can lawyers participate in this, in this particular sector or process? What is it that we can do? What is it that we need to do to ready ourselves to be able to take maximum benefit? For some of us who've been, doing a bit of this for a while, you realize that, as the Ugandan lawyers, you actually get to do probably 80% of the work, and you're paid, if you're lucky, 20% of the fees earned on a particular transaction, if you work as a transaction advisor. So what can we do to be able to, move ourselves to a position where we're probably doing 50-50 in terms of work and earning, or even more, or even better still, doing the whole thing as Ugandan lawyers in our own right. I am pleased to be joined this morning by a gentleman whom I have a lot of respect for. He's my partner at S&L Advocates. He works with me in the projects and infrastructure department, and also works in the corporate and commercial department. And we worked on many transactions together. He is Mr. Paul Mbuga. I know that a lot of you practitioners may have met him. You won't meet him in court ordinarily because this is what we do for a living. But we sometimes go to court. Some of these transactions end up in court once in a while. So where they need deep subject matter experts is when we come to throw our weight. Otherwise, we leave it to the dispute resolutions team. So ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Mr. Paul Mbuga, who will take us through this next session. He has a PowerPoint presentation that he's going to make. And then after all that, we will have the other panelists also stay around and be able to answer your questions as you may bring them along. So over to you, Paul.
Cool, thank you. Thank you very much, Nicholas. I think for a second I was afraid about what you may say in introduction. So we are just a quick outline of what we're going to discuss. This presentation will be heavily practitioner focused. We look at PPP classification, but in contrast to Jim and Oreno, we'll try to classify PPPs by understanding what they are not. We'll quickly look at the PPP metrics and who the potential transaction parties are, or potential clients. Nicholas, if you can be more direct. We'll look at opportunities for lawyers acting on the various sides of the PPP metrics, sponsors, project company, lenders, and the state party transaction advisory. And then we'll just do a brief headline points recap from a practitioner perspective. So we'll start. I feel the PPP Act is very clear about what a PPP is. But normally from a practitioner perspective, clients come to you basically like the Star Wars Armada. They come to you with an army of facts and army of ideas. What they think is a PPP is not a PPP, or what they do not think is a PPP is actually a PPP. So now from a practitioner perspective, what we'd like to emphasize here is what is not a PPP, based on what we see on the market, or what features do we see on the market for which it will be very clear to stress that this is not a PPP. Number one, from our experience, the presence of an implementation agreement or any other form of support agreement by the government, represented by ministry, of course, does not signify that that particular transaction is a PPP. An implementation agreement is really occupies a very special place in a project structure, particularly independently financed projects. The government provides certain specific assurances and guarantees and undertakings in support of the projects so that it can increase the viability profile of the project. That, by all accounts, does not mean that the project is a PPP. IAs are quite common for IPPs, independent power projects in the electricity sector, especially projects which are licensed by ERA, and you'll find a smattering of IAs as well in other projects across the country. But that does not mean the mere presence of an IA or a support agreement does not mean that the underlying transaction is a PPP, and that's a critical distinction. Number two, a land grant is not a PPP. The government does this a lot to support investors whose commercial or strategic objective the government agrees with, especially in view of the National Development Plan. The government tends to offer land grants where a long-term lease is offered through the Uganda Land Commission for just a nominal, or peppercorn, just a nominal lease amount, right? So as to assist the investor with land acquisition. I think the Aga Khan Hospital currently has benefited from a land grant. So now a land grant is a form of support by the state. It does not signify that is a PPP because the risk profile is not altered. The responsibility to finance, develop and operate the project and to assume the entire cluster of risk continues to rest with the private party. Number three, memoranda of understanding. This is a particular pain point for me or for us. A memorandum of understanding with the government does not signify a PPP. And I'd be very interested, Jim and Oreno, in your perspective after this discussion. From the practitioner side, we encounter several cases, over the course of a year, where clients come to you with MOUs which have been signed by various ministries, promising certain things and certain undertakings and certain forms of support, and many clients tend to think that those MOUs will guarantee a certain level of government commitment and assumption of risk that would ordinarily belong to a PPP. So one of the most difficult tasks for a lawyer on the private practitioner side when faced with an MOU is just how to carefully and diplomatically explain to the client that, look, the document you're holding might have been signed by the minister and the permanent secretary, but in the wider framework of analyzing project feasibility or project viability or what it means in terms of committing the government, it is not as useful. I was about to say useless, Jim, but I won't. It is not as useful. It is not as useful as you suspect. So the MOU, there are plenty of them flying around, and every time we are faced with them, we have to carefully explain the impact of those documents to the clients with whom they've been signed. So by all accounts, an MOU is a headline commitment for support by the state. It does not provide any risk consumption commitments. It does not provide any licensing commitments. It does not provide any financing commitments, and therefore cannot be classified as a PPP. Number 4, what is a PPP by what it's not? Parallel licensing regimes. Parallel licensing regimes occur in structures where you have a mandatory license or permit, which is granted by statute, but then at the same time, the supervisory framework for that particular license holder is also contained in a contract. So certain terms are contractually agreed between the granting body and the licensee. I think I can think of 2 very clear examples. One is in the petroleum, upstream petroleum sector. You have the statutory grant, which is the exploration and production license. But then in addition to that, you also have a contractual framework, the production sharing agreement between the state and the licensee. Those arrangements are not PPPs by all accounts. I think they're also present as well in the telco sector, particularly for holders of national, for the NTO license, the National Telecommunications Operator License. There is a statutory grant under the Uganda Communications Act, but then at the same time, there are other contractually agreed obligations in the license agreement between UCC and the operator. Those arrangements do not amount to PPPs. Then obviously, many times we are confronted by clients who actually present non-PPP structures, which they pitch as PPPs, but these are not. I think the common examples I've seen are management contracts. A management contract is exactly that, must also be distinguished from an O&M contract. Management contracts are largely input-based. I am hired to perform a service, I put in inputs, and normally my payment is conditional on 1 or 2 variables. I perform the service, I get paid. There's a very minimal set of risks which is assumed under such an arrangement. Lease and affirmages also rely on fixed fee remuneration structures. So there's a very minimal assumption of risk, as you would ordinarily see in a PPP. Design and build contracts are also exactly that, effectively turnkey contracts. For example, the construction of the Karuma hydropower dam, which is commonly thought of as being a PPP, but actually it is not. It is just a classic EPC arrangement. The contractor, Hydro, is in charge of constructing the dam and only assumes the construction risk, and after that will be the end. Then the ownership and operation of the dam. The ownership of the dam has always been with the state through UGCL, and then operation will revert to UGCL after the construction is done. So design build arrangements should also not be confused with PPPs. So that's important for us. Typically, when Jim and Loreno, when you people speak about these things, you normally have such a fantastic clarity of thought about what is a PPP and what is not. But clients normally don't come at you with the same clarity. So we always start strangely, we always start with a negative. Your first conversation with a client is to explain what you think you have is actually not what it is, and this is what it needs to be. So that's very important from a practitioner perspective. So what are the trigger points? Again, a key point of interaction between clients and private practitioners is clients always asking whether does the PPP Act apply to what I'm doing. And in my experience, all of them secretly hope that you say it doesn't apply for the reasons that you'll see. So there are certain trigger points you look out for. I think Jim explained in detail. A PPP is a contract for services and not acquisition of assets. So that particular component needs to be specifically looked out for. The private party comes in to perform what is essentially a public good or a service on behalf of a state party for an appropriate commercial benefit. It's not just merely an acquisition of assets. Even where the PPP structure involves a component of acquiring an asset, either taking possession or ownership for a defined time, there must always be an accompanying quality of service provision. So yes, number two, the private party normally supplies infrastructure assets and the services that are traditionally provided by the state. This is an element of risk allocation. Remember, the wider objective of a PPP is the state saying, in all honesty, that for various strategic purposes, I'm not able to provide this, both from an infrastructure perspective and from a service perspective, and I'm inviting the private party to assist me. One of the differentiating factors which practitioners always look out for, or should always look out for, is to accurately classify the nature of GOE's contribution. You saw in the previous slide that the common theme which clients normally approach us with is that any hint of government involvement, even if the government winks at you in the dark, a client immediately thinks, this has a semblance of a PPP, and maybe there's certain commitments which I can get. So it's always important to examine the nature of GOU's contribution, what kind of risk does GOU assume, what kind of commitment, and what is really the wider policy objective that the government has in mind when entering that transaction. Equity sometimes is an indicator. I know for Bujagali, the project company, government has a shareholding component. The government offered land as an asset to the project company, and in return took a Class C shareholding in the company. So now those are the kind of differentiating factors that can assist you to assess whether that particular set of facts or project qualifies as a PPP or not. Typically, the private party assumes the risk of operation and maintenance, so the technical and operational risk fully transferred to the private party. That's a key differentiating factor practitioners should look out for. Then, in terms of capital investment risk, which is effectively infrastructure, and then also the commercial and the market risk. All those are exclusively borne by the private party. The way the commercial risk works is in a typical or traditional service arrangement, there's normally a fixed fee payment, and the variables are pretty loose. Once a service is performed at a certain headline basis, payment is guaranteed. But the market risk in a PPP structure is it's obviously underwritten, and it must be carefully forecasted. But it's normally a bit more volatile. The private party assumes a certain element of, this has to go right for this to work for me, or the toll needs to work, or the user fee needs to be politically, it may be the user fee I'm charging may be commercially acceptable, but politically it may not. So there must be an element of market risk which the private party assumes. So yes, so for the services provided, the project company charges a user fee, or in the alternative, normally receives a payment from the state or contracting authority. Then I think a headline or a baseline factor, duration, is normally a key indicator of whether there's an intention to signify a PPP or not. They're typically over a long period of time. And then finally, there's normally a retransfer of ownership. at the end of the cycle. Oreno spoke about that. So those are key trigger points in the event a practitioner has, like we always are, has to assess whether the PPP Act and the process applies to a particular set of facts. So in terms of we're going to the parties shortly. So in terms of the parties, that is effectively a PPP structure chart. On the left, you normally have the financing side, typically debt and equity or a combination of both. Then you have the project SPV, which will implement the project and enter into the underlying project agreement with the government or the contracting authority, as the case may be. The government obviously at the top as a concessionaire, and then on the right you normally have a raft of experts who provide services especially to the project company. So where does the legal practitioner come in? Legal practitioners normally act for finances. There's a term you might have heard of it called local counsel, right? That is a coronation we receive when it's a coronation we receive when an external financing party with international counsel assistance then comes down to look for specific Ugandan law Ugandan law advice. We are mostly hired on the financing side because commercial banks, because of various balance sheet constraints and credit classification guidelines, financing for PPPs normally tends to come from a certain club. So the way they get into contact with us is either through international counsel or in some cases, but extremely rare, that procurement is normally done, can be done directly in country. Then obviously on the government side, the role of the legal expert is usually as part of a transaction advisory team. A legal expert, at least as far as I understand the structure, cannot on his own or her own, or the firm on its own account. A legal expert cannot act for a state party individually. It's always part of a transaction advisory team, and there are certain strategic collaborations which law firms have to think about. I'll speak about that shortly. The sponsors of the project SPV, normally the initiator of the transaction, and they normally come in at the start. They require extensive support from the initiation of the project up to financial close and construction and commercial operations, and even for a significant period thereafter. Yet again, the entry point sometimes is through international counsel. Some of them come into the market and source for expertise locally. And then finally you have various support. You have contractors and suppliers to the project company, and there can be a raft of all of this need legal support in one way or the other. So in terms of headline points, I think from the practitioner side, I'll start with the RFP procurement process. I think to secure any mandate to act for any of the parties in the PPP metrics, there's a significant investment that is required in participating in bidding. I'm sure many people who are attending this session will confess, or personally I'll confess, and even Nicholas, I hope you'll join my confession. We spend nights and days pining for PPP work until the RFP document comes out, and then you start to wonder what you got yourself into. So PPP procurement, from a practitioner perspective, to either act as a TA, to be part of the TA team to the state party, to be part of the lender advisory team, or even to be part of the team or the sole person advising the sponsors. There is a significant process of procurement. It is demanding, it is time consuming, and it requires commitment, right? So it's important to make certain investment in resources and understand the art of bidding. Now PPPs require significant collaboration. Actually, my experience, and I'm not sure if you see the same thing, Jim, in the PPP unit, the lawyer tends to be the last person in the chain. Normally in the PPP structuring framework, the focus is on the technical analysis, the engineering analysis, the financial analysis. There's always a significant political assessment. The project may be technically viable, but may not be politically deliverable. And then when all that work is done, that is when the lawyer, or that is when the law firm comes in at the end. And so it's very easy to miss out on opportunities if the process chain is not well understood. So collaborations for law firms are important. PPPs normally bring just a melting pot of every conceivable expert you can think about: assurance and advisory firms, investment bankers, financial analysts, technical engineer consultants, etc. So from the practitioner perspective, developing cross-cutting relationships with people who have the skills is important, because it is often the case that they tend to be involved in the PPP process much earlier than lawyers or law firms do. PPPs are significantly or even exclusively practitioner-based, so it's important for training and upskilling opportunities. We are speaking about PPPs broadly now, but even within the wider PPP ecosystem, they are discrete pieces of specialization which normally are required depending on the stage of the transaction. I've worked on a couple of transactions. If there's a PPP risk issue, there's someone else. If there's a PPP insurance issue, there's another expert for that. If there's a PPP subcontracting issue, there's an expert for that. There's an expert for O&M. There's an expert for the balance of risk. It can be quite intimidating. So upskilling is important, especially for us. Our jurisdiction is a bit unique. Many Ugandan lawyers, we qualify as fused practitioners. What LDC produces is a fused practitioner who can handle both traditional solicitor work and also what you call barrister work. So obtaining practice expertise is important. The PPP guidelines are singularly important. I've been in many cases, right, Jim, where some people do not know about the PPP guidelines. The PPP Act and the regulations are great, but I think the PPP guidelines provide a wonderful explanation of how the entire PPP project cycle works and what the respective allocation of responsibilities for each party is. It's very important to understand them. From the practitioner side, PPPs are extremely document-heavy transactions. The typical PPP transaction cycle has pen down, what you call pen down times, idle times, but then there are times when it's extremely busy. And I think when confronted with such a phase, right, a lawyer would be entitled to wonder what hit them. So you need personnel is important, personnel allocation is important, and also tracking systems as well. Now, costing and pricing, I know Nicholas mentioned it, and it's something we debate a lot in our own circle as lawyers, and we always struggle with, to be honest, with the dynamic between, I think the way the international legal market works is there's a certain pricing level or certain pricing band which is expected for legal fees in developing markets, and then legal fees in international markets. It's a debate that's happened even in the oil and gas sector. People say, the firms in London or the USA or South Africa earn much more money than the local firms and etc. I think it's a very difficult issue. We will not address it here, but it's important not to always, at least from the practitioner perspective, it's important not to take the point emotionally. My understanding over time is that there's always a delicate balance of risk in terms of the risk assumed by the law firms practicing in the international markets and the risk assumed by us, so-called local counsel, and that ultimately determines the pricing that local law firms are able to command when being involved in such transaction. I think the only advice I can give, Nicholas will come in later, is it's important to be transparent and to be consensual, but also the Ugandan law practitioner must also privately acknowledge that the balance of risk which is assumed by by the law firm in the international market is much higher than what you probably are, and that would account for the what will be considered to be the unacceptable disparity in legal fees being charged. All right, so this is a bit more granular. In the next 2 or 3 slides, we'll look at the opportunities for each transaction party. I think we'll start with the project company, project development, the opportunities, the opportunities for practitioners on the sponsor side. The initial point of instruction tends to be quite basic. You assist the project sponsors or the project company with corporate needs, and compliance requirements, and then you start working through a comprehensive step plan as the client moves progressively towards PPP close. So normally we establish the project company. This happens a lot as the client starts to work on the other technical aspects. Now, one of the most interesting aspects you always face if you act on the project development side is PPP procurement. Remember, in the beginning we discussed, does a PPP Act apply to my project? In some cases, our assessment is no. In some cases, our assessment is yes. Now, this is typically what happens. Having determined from a technical basis that the PPP Act applies, we now go into the very difficult problem of procurement. So option 1, this is quite universal, Jim and Loreno, and I'd be very interested in your experience on this after this session or during the Q&A. The vast majority of clients are interested in option 1, direct procurement, right? Which is sole source procurement. You need to demonstrate uniqueness, you need to demonstrate urgency, you need to demonstrate that the service being provided belongs to a certain exceptional category. So obviously there's a process of cabinet approval, and you know the cabinet approval process in this country can be quite opaque. I say that respectfully. The cabinet approval process it's not based on a very objective criteria that if I fulfill these 8 things I'll automatically get cabinet approval. And you know that once you take anything to cabinet, I think cabinet has almost a fiduciary responsibility to also assess political impact, right? And whether you know, in addition to technical and all these other things, whether the project is politically deliverable. So cabinet approval is necessary, and then you have the bridge negotiation procedure. So option 1, Jim, I cannot. There are countless number of times when we are asked what is the best way. Now that you've given me the news, either good or bad, that the PPP Act applies to me, what is the most effective and efficient way that I can succeed in getting to contracting under option 1? You know, and direct procurement, for many reasons, presents its own difficulties. Option 2, which is what some would consider to be the traditional or globally accepted approach, is to take your client through the competitive tender process. Oreno spoke about this. So you move through inception, feasibility, competitive procurement, contracting stage, and implementation stage. It takes a bit of time. I think the complaints we receive from clients about option 2 is the lead period for a successful PPP competitive procurement to be completed. The private party may be organized, and normally they do, because you know they pay top dollars for a suite of advisors. But some of the complaints we receive normally concern the preparedness of the government side, not the PPP unit by all accounts, but the contracting, the contracting authority. Yeah, and I think another thing that is probably not well understood, and I've mentioned this I think a number of times before, a project may be technically fantastic, but may present political issues, and so sometimes clients struggle to understand why is this procurement stuck at the feasibility stage, or we've been at competitive stage for 6 months. Well, what is going on? And there may be issues. So from the practitioner side, after the initial point of contact and running through the motions from a corporate perspective, a significant effort or significant dedication will be spent on the PPP procurement stage, and obviously a lot will depend on whether you're able to deliver or secure a result with option 1 and option 2. Then following that, the customary work starts, licensing and permitting. There will traditionally be a component of project finance. So there will be significant time spent as borrowers counsel and assisting with the process of condition precedent satisfaction. And then hopefully commercial operations is successfully attained, and then you move to supporting the client during the operational phase. The second part here, the lenders. This is always a difficult discussion. Many times when we talk about practitioner opportunities with lenders, the question that always comes back to me is, it all sounds nice and it all sounds pretty, but what is the entry point, into that club for what you'd consider to be the normal everyday lawyer? So PPP lender financing, I might have mentioned earlier that commercial banks struggle with project finance for various reasons, balance sheet size and also credit classification. It can be a bit hard I think it will be impossible for a local commercial bank to carry a certain level of debt for 20 years unless it's providing periodic bridge financing. So PPP lender financing almost exclusively comes from DFIs and other multilateral lenders. So typical limited recourse finance, where the focus is on the project and its ability to generate cash flows, and in the event of any issues, the lender's recourse is limited, right? Is limited to the project, its assets and its cash flows. I think the key concern from a practitioner perspective is how does the PPP, how do PPP project finance lenders procure Ugandan counsel? And I think it is not indiscreet of me to say this. I think the common view in the market is that some of this work tends to go to an exclusive club of practitioners, or you must have an international counsel affiliation to be able to come within view of a PFI lender, or you must have a best friend relationship with an international law firm. Again, I accept it's a difficult question. I would say, however modestly, it's like most international, specialized structures for legal services. There appears to be a certain level of unwritten organization around this. The manner in which PFI lenders procure Ugandan lawyers or Ugandan counsel is very specific, and I think for the local practitioner, it will be important to consciously examine if there are any ways which can be explored to take advantage of that club. But yes, I do agree that the entry point is a bit restrictive. So having succeeded with entry, right, as difficult as it may appear, then the typical or the traditional work as lenders counsel in a project finance structure commences. We spend an extensive amount of time on project and project company due diligence. We look at corporate matters, integrity of PPP procurement. Lenders cover all aspects of risk, including historical risk, events which any person would consider to have been concluded. A lender's focus will be to ensure that it is never reopened. So we spend a lot of time on PPP, examining the integrity of the PPP procurement, feasibility analysis of the project agreements, other material contracts, right to assets is important, governmental approvals, obviously a key risk factor, and then there are also specialists who come in for ESG, insurance, and tax. Normally in a typical PPP or project financing DD, the risk matrix will include other areas of specialization. So the legal advisor is traditionally required to work quite closely with a number of other experts. Then certainly the condition precedent review and satisfaction checklist, normally confronted with an almost 100 or 200 page list of items that the lender needs to be satisfied about before declaring financial close. The practitioner will spend a lot of time on the security package. The security package for typical PPP finance is traditional in one hand, but then at the same time, it is also not traditional. In most cases, the project company does not have what you call a traditional asset base, land and whatnot. So there are certain security structures which the lender is heavily interested in, security assignments of contractual rights, debentures over fixed and movable assets, accounts charges, and also third-party security. Quasi-security is also increasingly important. Quasi-security is that security which is not traditional security as you understand it, which attaches to an asset which you can feel and see. But quasi-security is designed to make the lender's position stronger in the event of insolvency. So there are certain things which lenders will ask for, which are supposed to give them direct access to certain rights and benefits, so that that access is not interrupted by an event of insolvency. So direct agreements, for example, sponsor support with the sponsors or shareholders of the project company, negative pledges and guarantees, particularly from the sponsors. So the Ugandan practitioner scope of work will include providing a lot of advice on the security package, project level, shareholder level, and also quasi security. At the end of the deal, before financial close, a lot of time is spent on the legal opinion. I think over time the scope has evolved. Many of you who have been involved in PPP financing work or traditional project finance, in some of our private conversations, we have always spoken about what exactly is the scope of the Ugandan law legal opinion. Traditionally, lenders come to you looking for a capacity and enforceability opinion, which is supposed to be the simplest form of opinion, where you opine on the capacity of the parties and the enforceability of the documents and the material that the lender is relying upon to approve the loan facility. But it's not that simple. I think the traditional local counsel opinion, given the formulation of risk by the lender and the kind of assurances and guarantees that a lender requires to successfully have a facility approved by credit or investment committees, the typical Ugandan law opinion will cover much more and provide a much broader level of assurance than the typical capacity and enforceability opinion, which, for example, you'll see English counsel issuing, and perhaps you're very nice people, Nicholas, because I think the typical Ugandan practitioner is happy to confirm certain aspects in a legal opinion, which an international law firm would never consider touching. But we do some of these things to give the lender comfort, because there are certain cultural things which we understand and which a lender may not be able to fully be comforted about unless they appear in a local counsel opinion. So your typical Ugandan law opinion in a PPP or PF finance will be much more expansive than the traditional range of capacity and enforceability confirmations. Then from the lender perspective, transaction monitoring. Sometimes the mandate ends immediately after financial close. In some cases, certain lenders normally implement enhanced monitoring, especially for PPPs and the construction and engineering phase, just to ensure that there is no upset of the risk balance. So the practitioner may be required to also provide significant support during transaction monitoring. And our counsel to the state party, the contracting party. Really transaction advisory. I think the legal function I mentioned earlier, when acting for the state party or the contracting authority, the legal function normally sits within the transaction advisory team. I was involved in a case a couple of years ago where I think the pitch in this case was being made directly from law firm to contracting authority, and it wasn't successful. I think the broad framework, especially if you examine the manner in which the PPP guidelines formulate the type of assistance that a contracting authority is supposed to obtain, the broad framework is that the legal function sits as part of the transaction advisor, which means that for a practitioner interested in providing transaction advisory expertise, or for a practitioner interested in providing assistance to a contracting authority, it is very important to have some form of collaboration with firms or entities which provide transaction advisory abilities. But obviously, first things first, the framework for state parties onboarding transaction advisors requires an extensive tender process, right? This is one of the most feared documents. Many junior associates in law firms lose sleep, right? When you see the heading RFP, transaction advisor for this, and this. And then there are 140 pages of requirements and all these things. And the power of attorney has to be signed in lateral flow. And then the consortium agreement has to be inverted to the right. And then if the power of attorney has 3 pages instead of 2, you get knocked out at the evaluation stage. So acting for state parties or being part of transaction advisory teams for the practitioner requires a significant commitment in terms of the competitive tender process. Someone once joked to me, Jim, that they thought World Bank tenders were torturous until RFPs for transaction advisors came out. So yes, so even before the practitioner thinks about the technical work that will follow, a significant input needs to be put in responding to the RFP for the transaction advisor. Normally, it's typically part of a consortium. The law firm, typically, there's normally a segment for you to make contribution in terms of a methodology statement for the legal work stream, providing a viability analysis, in addition, naturally, to drafting the legal documents that the consortium requires. I mean, we often joke many times that dealing with an RFP, responding to an RFP for a transaction advisor, is a transaction in its own right, right? So probably we'll ask the PPP unit to create a professional fee framework just for responding to an RFP for a TA role. So if successful, I spoke earlier that there's a detailed process for procurement for the TA to be onboarded, and all the consortium parties need to exercise a singular level of patience. If successful, and the practitioner and the team is now able to work for the state party, the work which follows normally starts with project feasibility, assuming the feasibility is accepted and the project is not terminated for one reason or the other. Then we proceed to preparing an entire suite of legal documents. There are hundreds to mention. We work very closely with the private, with the TA on the procurement of the private party. In most cases, we don't draft. The project agreement is reviewed. The state parties have reached a level now where, as part of the tender process, a draft of the project agreement, either concession agreement or whichever the case may be, is normally turned over for extensive review, and then the protracted process of risk allocation starts from there. Negotiation and closing, and then after, there's normally residual support, right, to the lead, to the TA and the state party after closing. But obviously, and I say this cheekily, within the limits of contract variation under the PPDA Act, it can be very easy. It can be very easy for the practitioner to be carried away and provide a whole range of services, only to be told later, no, I can only vary your fee up to a certain extent. So there are certain constraints in terms of billing when you're acting for, when the practitioner is acting for the state side. Now, how essential is international counsel support? On the state side, it's, I think in my experience, I'd be interested, I mean, Jim and Lorena, what you have seen. I think what I've seen so far, and Nicholas, you can confirm, it will appear to be important. I think where the level of PPP development and assessment is, even where the local law firm is participating as a Ugandan legal expert, my understanding of the market is that there appears to be a certain expectation that there will be some international expertise that will be brought to bear, at least until such a level that the market feels that there's a certain level of skill in which law firms can bring without support. I mean, it's a point we can debate. I'd be very interested in the experience of law firms which have tried to submit proposals without international council support, or like an international council sort of patron saint of some sort, and then law firms would submit such proposals with international council support. Our experience from the contracting authority side, and I'm not sure, Jim, whether this comes from the PPP unit, but our experience from the contracting authority side is that there is an expectation that there will be a legal expert of international repute. So that means that the Ugandan practitioner, in order to be competitive, must be able to find some form of alliance when submitting the proposal. But you can let us know if it is something you normally expect, something that you normally expect to see. All right, so thank you very much. Those are the points that we felt we should cover from a practitioner perspective.
Thank you very much, Paul. I am hoping that our audience has been able to pick a few lessons from this particular segment of the presentation. Maybe just to add a little from my own perspective, as Paul has said, it is very difficult to do PPPs or serious contract work or infrastructure work alongside your day-to-day job as a lawyer. And we've seen it, sometimes you have peak seasons where you're working almost 16 hours a day constantly for 2-3 weeks, then it wanes down a bit. So we are one department in our firm where we always ask the managing partner, but should we wear suits to work every day? I mean, if there's a downtime, why don't you allow us to put on jeans, come with our t-shirts and do what we do best? But maybe that is for another day. Just to weigh in on the issue of international council, I am one person who is very averse to being referred to as local council for the connotations it comes along with, because you quickly actually get to realize that probably you know a lot more than some of these international council. But because of what they do and where how they pitch themselves, you will end up paying them $800-900 an hour, and you will have a paltry $300 if you're lucky. But what do they come along with? Certainly they have pedigree. They will have done this. At SNL we say, we've done 40 years and we are 42 years and counting. Even at individual levels, you can say, yes, I've done 21, 22 years, post-qualification, which counts for something. So when it comes to a typical evaluation, all these things come into play. You will see, DLA or, White and Case 1907, that amount of experience alone cannot be discounted. Whether they get, whether because of the name they get to deliver a lot more than we can deliver, in country, that is really up in the air. It is the clients who are able to, confirm or deny whether, they bring in better expertise. But what I know is they bring in, the length of time, dedicated expertise. But above all, they have insurance. They have professional indemnity. I will tell you that, for a law firm like us, when we started off having professional indemnity of about, what, 500 million? Mm-hmm. Then it went to $1 billion, then it went to $1 million, and then it went to $2 million, depending on the level and, sheer size of the transactions you handle. And then you realize that as part of DLA Africa, you have extra cover of about $20 million. So certainly some of these things are things that, people will look out for, to say, in the event you gave a wrong legal opinion, what kind of recourse will we have? But it's something that you only get to develop expertise around by getting to do the exact work. So it remains to be seen. So ladies and gentlemen, I think we did not want to pack all this with so much presentation. We are hoping we can now open it up for discussion. I don't know whether Jim or Orono, you have any small thoughts or comments we want to make in supplement to what Paul has done before we open it up for the questions and answers. Or are you happy for us to just take?
I think well, I think I can do it from here because we're still doing the tour.
Maybe you can come this way. Paul can just pull.
You're able to. He's going to move it. And the microphone is able to pick. Yes. Oh, fantastic. Cool. That's fantastic. Yes. So I really think having listened to I'm really excited because we always find a problem as a unit trying to take telecontracting agencies and part of government that you reach that stage when you need a transaction advisor, and those people do not come cheap. So whereas Paul has listed the catalog of the pains and so on, what he has not told us is that we actually compensate you for the sleepless night and handsomely. And so when we normally flag a figure, let's say we speak in volumes of about $1 million going up to about 3. Somebody would then say, oh, wait a moment, so do I actually need these people? Because I can actually put $1 million in a slab and then wait for another year to put another level of a building. So do I need transaction advisors? And coming from a country and the experience we've had, that becomes a question you have to deal with. The way you've catalogued the issues we go through, the things that have to be done, and the keywords you bring on board before you engage and you are in with the 2 legs. You then realize that actually this is the value that you require. So for me, that's a very important issue that came through, and I would want to associate with it. The second issue was the issue of MOUs. This is a monster, I don't want to say it's a monster in the house. And they've been with us. I think it comes from pressure, and we have started a process as a PPP unit to try and engage government, and we're beginning to get successful. SG's office started a pushback of sorts when it comes to PPPs. Every time people have gone to ask for MOUs, and particularly some ministries, they've sort of pushed back and asked us to confirm that this is what we would want to do. When they note that it's first government, I think, took a decision that when the MOUs are allowed, they will not be so committal in the drafting and so on. So I think an improvement in the AG's office. I don't want to speak for them, but I know that there's a commitment to really make them lighter. We know where we've come from. These became popular tools when Chinese money came to Uganda, and we know exactly why they wanted them, because somehow in their environment they triggered the release of funds from government to enable these companies to come and compete. So it was always important for them to get an MOU. But again, the writing and the inclusions became an issue. So increasingly, we're diluting them, but they are here to. They are there from a PP perspective. They don't need a commitment, as you rightly put it, and we do not necessarily recognize them. Yes, we agree, design and build, and so many other formulations. Actually, last night, a certain forum, we were discussing an implementation framework where words like design and build were used. And the moment somebody saw those, he says, oh, that's a PPP. I will also add that, and carefully here, but because we are into an intellectual training rather, I would add that there are also other things which have been delivered and have been called PPPs, Kampala Inter Expressway. But when you look at the structure and everything that went in there, then they are not. But towards the end, during implementation, an element of PPP has been brought in to allow operation and maintenance to be actually private sector led. So we are careful, and Paul, this comes from the history of the terminology. The terminology was captured by early in the days before the Act came in place. So the buzzword became so popular that political actors used it for anything and everything. So if somebody wanted the Chiseka market, they say private sector, PPP. If somebody wanted the city square, private sector, PPP. So it became an easy word to sell a deal, but not necessarily. And so from my perspective, our perspective is that the Act created, sanitized all of that, and we now operate from something that we know should empower all of us to move forward. A quick one on the potential of lawyers acting into the lender space. I agree with you, and the lenders will default because of the limitations of the results they have and all of the other risks. But I think there's something that we've not explored. Lawyers trying to, practices like yours, trying to look at the function of syndication or arranging finances, quasi PFI. But you know, it comes closer to that, and it can be enabled by you as long as you get into that space where you reinforce the risk from the banking in the local setup, from the traditional bank operations. Because you have recourse, you have the assets that are developed to mortgage it to the facility and so on, and they will not sit on the books of the bank. The bank will not take that risk because of the regulatory framework in Uganda. So what we're beginning to see is the institutions that are changing in operation. So in the case of Stanbic, you see Stanbic Holdings. And then you know exactly what they're trying to do to go around that requirement. So I think lawyers have a role they can play here. And enable these relationships to thrive so that we have local banks playing. Now the question I had though, and I know that you guys have played roles in some of this, what is it that we call local banks? Because these lawyers have done a lot of damage to our economy, but local banks have all become international. Because I'm looking at ABSA, I'm looking at Stanchart, I'm looking at Stanbic, and I'm really lost at which is local and which is not. So I think we need to find a way of helping to deal with some of these challenges. But lastly, direct agreements. Actually, that's another area where you have it as a solution for the lenders. You have it as a challenge on the side of government. Because when you place an agreement for approval, and you indicate in the structure somewhere that the lenders have stepping rights through the direct agreement, we told we're selling the country because we sort of protecting a lot more of the private sector than it was. But little do we then realize that actually the private sector, we only be a private sector, the backing of the lawyers, not the lenders, and the lenders cannot risk their money. So these are things that we believe that as we grow our legal practice, the market, practitioners like you coming on board, the society taking interest and picking on to these trainings and encouraging them and encouraging members to adapt, even learn from those who have been at it, like S&L and Shinubi and a few others that I can remember, Denton and others. Then you potentially going to reach that stage where we're able to stand up and say, wait a moment, this is exactly what it means, and we influence policy. It's one thing me and Ron have had an opportunity, and I think Nicholas at one point trying to push this act through from framing through the law. It became personal that the legislators at times see it as you trying to create an opportunity for yourself. They don't see the big good. But when the practitioners like you, who are consumers of these laws, start to mainstream these issues and make them clear to them, then they see the economic impact of the law, as opposed to seeing it as an opportunity for employment for all and Jim. Lastly, my belief is that legal practice, and this is a layman's opinion, is evolving in Uganda. You cannot afford to reinvent the wheel, to not tap into the expertise, the resources, the richness of the international lawyers. Now, excuse the word local. We'll say home-based lawyers.
National Council.
So the National Council has quite deep reach and the knowledge of the nation. But these guys have been at it for years. They have framework contracts, they have templates, they have everything. They're bringing a lot more to bear. It will be a cost for us if we did it locally. But we can also tap into other available sources that have been created. The African finance ministers, realizing that they were signing deals that would backfire, deliberately with the engagement of African Government Bank, created the ALS, African Legal Support Facility, which is purely legal. And as we all know, it doesn't have its own lawyers, but it compounds, brings on board these projects, looks out for competencies, and if our Ugandan law firms tick those boxes, they undertake a due diligence. They undertake a due diligence on the projects we do, but they also undertake a due diligence on the law firms that they want to hire. And to the extent that you tick those boxes, chances are that you're going to get the deals from Africa Legal Support Facility. And they will backstop you, which is a beautiful thing. So I think our local firms should, again, they are...
No, that's fine. You're protected for today.
Our national firms should, but also remember that the deals we are getting with Kampala Jinja Expressway is $1 billion. If we trusted that deal to a national, I've got that right, to a national firm, the fact of the matter is non-national investor will mobilize $1 billion. So chances are that we will mobilize $1 billion from internationals. And the internationals are still stuck in their world. They still need that stamp from DLA to be a business units. So I think what we are doing in the sector, in the profession, amalgamating, associating, creating these synergies you are creating is a positive start. And as we do that, we start doing bigger deals, and the expertise comes in, and we grow. So for me, it's not hopelessness. And then it's also good to have a piece of $1 billion as your legal fees.
And have
nothing.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Okay, thank you very much. I think for the purpose of our audience, I think we need to open this up so that I know that we have we could give about 30 minutes for the Q&A. I don't know how many questions we have out there, but if you could just let us know, is there any way of making it bigger? Can you make it bigger? A little bigger?
Can you see?
You can see it? Okay. I've just seen 2 comments. Excellent presentation, Paul. Please send your questions from here. Okay, that's from the ULS. So do we have any questions, or people have gotten knocked out by PPPs? I know that earlier in the presentation we had a couple of questions before. Go to the chat room and just...
That's it.
That's all. There were a lot more questions than that, I'm sure. Sorry? So, the audience out there, if you have any questions, it's not every day that I get Jim and Otoyo in the same room to be able to answer our questions.
So you need to log in. Okay, maybe you can log in. So you can read the questions.
Yeah, it may be easier that way.
Let me go and get there.
Sorry? No, I can just log in here. Sorry? Okay. So I think there's a question on the chat from Jude Gamkama. Hello, how can we improve transparency and accountability in PPPs in Uganda, for example, in the Luvowa projects? I think that will fall squarely within Jim's.
Jim needs to take his seat.
Yes. Jim, I think you can come and sit here. Yes, so Jim, you can tell us about
it's interesting. Jude, you're following following me wherever I go. The reason I'm laughing, we've had a very interesting discussion with Jude over a period of time, but some of the issues we discussed actually came through last night and the day before. Yeah. But one, to start with the, I agree. We actually need to keep redefining PPPs, and your Paul's presentation spoke to that. Not everything that's being done in the country, that's actually PPP, and indeed the Luvowa. I have learned to keep saying Project X as done as under the PPP Act, to draw the distinction. So to some extent, Luvowa has a characteristics of private sector coming in to offer solution, but the structuring and all the issues that are related to it with government taking a lot of risk back, including financing and so on, and the warranties, does not necessarily make it a PPP. And that way, I wouldn't want to disassociate. It's the wrong forum for me to do that. But to say that it was not structured as a PPP, therefore it's not under the Act and it's not a PPP. But the way to deal with these transparencies is, I think, as a country, we will need to reach that stage in time when we quantify the risks we are assuming. So you look at interventions you do today, and what are they? What do they mean going forward? What is it that is going to hit you 2-3 years when you start paying? You've made undertakings and you have to pay back. And the moment we start seeing the weight of debt and the impacts and commitments and physical liabilities, then we'll probably wake up to the fact that we don't have to sign off some of these things quickly. But on the flip side, and Jude, being a lawyer, you know that the ideal world in which we operate and the profession is completely different from the politician's world. Politician has a lifespan, shelf life of 5 years.
At any one point in time.
Yes, and the shelf life must be utilized 100%. So probably it's a balance of the two. But yes, I know we need to reach that stage where we say, okay, what are we looking for? It's a specialized hospital. Who have built specialized hospitals in the world? Where are they? Who built them? How do they do them? And therefore, this person has given us this proposition. How do we then put it to test? Or no, when we talked, and one way we've toured that, maybe to answer Jude directly, in the PPP framework, we have what we call an unsolicited proposal. If Uganda is not at the point of building a specialized hospital, but somebody wants to build it, then we'll categorize that as an unsolicited proposal. Then we'll require that we test it against the market. And that's what Orono was saying. We then put it we open it up. When you open it up, we want to see how the market will react with the same things delivered similarly. And the moment we get that quotation, then we ask you to match it or bring your cost down. We still give you the right to deliver the solution, same specs, but we are now informed by the market. So there's nothing like taking us to the dry cleaner for a thorough wash. Yeah, so I think that's the answer I could give. But yes, we need transparency, and we didn't realize that any contract we undertake as the public sector today has a direct bearing on the load that we are taking on board. The other thing we've done, Jude, we've also made sure that in PPPs, fiscal commitment and contingent liabilities are captured from day one before we conclude the contract, and they are reported to the Treasury. So there's nothing like, oh, they signed this deal and we don't know how much they committed us. Yeah. So it's known from the word go. It's disclosed. We have a disclosure portal. When you go on our website, you say disclosure portal. It discloses details of the deal, who is the contractor, how much we are in for, and everything about the transaction. And that way, that openness will invite in the public to scrutinize these transactions. It's, I think, a lot more open approach to dealing with public-private partnerships.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim, for that clarification. I know that there's a comment. Can we please have the available PPP deals so that they can be known by the members? And this is something that probably we didn't cover in our presentations, but we know that post the Act, there are a couple of deals that have been lined up and are being followed up. But even before the passing of the Act in 2015, there are many transactions which, you know, when you go, if you go through the metrics of a typical PPP, would actually tick quite a lot of those boxes. So there are those transactions that we did in the past, before the enactment of the Act, which were really, you know, governed by either the licensing regimes of particular, you know, sectors in the economy, like in the power sector, for example, and they were largely, you know, governed by the Contracts Act. So you'll find projects like Bujagali really that provide a public good for a return with appropriate risk allocation, and all these, you know, were done before the Act, but actually they tick quite a lot of boxes. So post the Act, certainly we've shared the pipeline of projects, but we're happy to share those same, you know, projects with the membership, you know, through the ULS portal. And also probably just share with you the website of the PPP unit in the Ministry of Finance, where you'll find some of these. So are there any other questions from members as we go along? We still have about maybe 20 minutes before we start winding down for today.
And maybe as we look out for questions, I just added that Orono shared a list on the website of the PPP unit at www.pppunit.go.ug. You have a long list of potential wish list of PPPs which will go through screening. You have a narrower list which has gone through registration, and then we're currently working on those that are either at feasibility study stage. Good Logistics Hub is one of them, Kampala Jinja Expressway at the competitive dialogue stage. We have a water project, NITA-U, which is a final feasibility study, draft feasibility study stage. They're beginning to come on, but as we said, and what Paul referred to as exhaustive, tiring, process is all about making sure that the feasibility study and all the preparatory work that go in before we tender have completeness. Okay. And that's what, by the way, addresses the issue. When you said you have an uncertainty, you start, a client comes to you and you start as lawyers on a project, and then all of a sudden they are saying, oh, we are not moving. The question is, why would they move before the approvals? Because the tender process, the RFP, will be released as a full RFP with the documentation that you need to submit a bid. So that means they are jump-starting the process. So if they jump-start, then they have to wait it out to make sure that we go through the preparation. Otherwise, when the project is prepared and has been reached tender stage, then it should be ready to go. That does not mean that there are no projects that suffer from political and other interferences. A case in example is Kampala Jinja, I think we were ready 2 years ago, and a few things, and we waited it out, and then COVID, and here we are, but we are in the market. So I agree with you, Paul. Those are circumstances that are beyond that you need to look out for, and that's the risk of doing business. Your TA team, the legal teams and others will still be charging for that because you're holding them, you retained them. So that's a cost of doing projects, and that's why PPPs are known for two things. One, the cost of project preparation, but also the cost of legal advisory, transaction advisory. Those two costs are quite, but you know what they do is because of the completeness of documentation, the exhaustiveness of discussions and back and forward, then by the time you sign, you have a deal that you're actually going to deliver. And that's the beauty. You then have a deal that has been agreed to by both parties, risks allocated wherever they are supposed to do, insurance taken, underwriting done, everything that you need to do, and then you're moving, and it's easy. Then all you have to do is now have your dashboard where you click and go.
Okay, thank you. I think we have a few comments more than questions. We have a comment from Lona, just thanking us for Lona Mutojo, thanking us for the excellent presentation. But she also has a question. She was wondering whether the country really has some ongoing projects, PPP projects, and that we can talk about and learn from and draw practical experiences from. Lona, I think we discussed this, and that is the list that was put up, and some of which we are still talking about now, like the Kampala Jinja Expressway. And I would really encourage practitioners to reach out to the unit, start by checking on their website, make appointments, go and understand, so that when clients call you, at least you've had the opportunity of interfacing. A discourse like this would have really been good if it was physical, but for the limitations we all understand, we have to do it virtually. But knowing people like Mr. Mugunga and Mr. Otweyo would be a good starting point in terms of trying to understand how we can all partake of this vibrant facet of legal practice. Paul, I don't know whether you can read that question. What mechanisms would you say?
What mechanisms would you say are
realistically available for enforcement of obligations? Yeah. Would you say that there's the lack of political will hinder move to
hold private parties or even contracting authorities accountable? I think I get the question, but without a clear example, you wouldn't. But I think political actors have always had one MasterCard up their sleeve, and that's the law. The law is very clear, the do's and don'ts. if a contracting authority does something outside the law, they're accountable.
Sure.
Contracting public accounting officers are personally liable for decisions they take. If a public officer signs out a PPP without going through the process, they can actually still do it, but they're taking the risk and they'll be personally liable. The will to prosecute, I mean, agencies of government that are supposed to do that are there. I don't think political will without an example means.
I think I understand where the question, the person is coming from. We've seen many projects in this country where, you know, on paper, all of us have done a fantastic job putting together the project as transaction advisor, and it's handed over to government, and then is there the will to follow up? And Jim, you know, I worked with you on Kilembe Mines, for example. Everybody knows that, you know, on the TS side, you know, due diligence was done. You have a player on who signs up with government. You know, what is the will to be able to hold people accountable? Because if I remember, normally before you sign up for the transaction advisor, you have a whole matrix of everything. This person is supposed to pay on this date, please check. This person is supposed to, you know, have developed this kind of parameters in resuscitating the mine. This person is supposed to develop a smelter by year 2 or so. So you actually leave a checklist. Now, I don't know whether there's somebody who sits there to actually say, okay, what does this matrix say? And are we holding this person accountable? Because you always have telltale signs. When a concessionaire, for example, fails to pay up their, you know, signature fee within the time that they have said they would do, you know, how much more leverage can you give him before you know that this thing may be going south? Yeah. At what point do you say, okay, let's cut our losses at this point? Yes, we've gone through all this process. Do we start the competitive dialogue with number 2 to try and bring them back on board and get the person who won but who is not being able to deliver?
And I think I agree with you. And I think in that particular case, now that we're dealing with a particular example, I would be among us those who say that's a typical example where the triggers were monitored and actually government pulled the plug.
How early?
Now that's a different But you see, the pulling the plug, you see the lawyers sit on either side. So what they've done is they built in mechanisms that you go through and the process you go through before you go to say to pull the plug. Mediation, arbitration, you keep using interchangeably these words, I don't even know what they mean. So what you've done, you built a mechanism into a layering of processes before you actually pull the plug. And because you do not want to suffer those costs, you have to go through that process. Sure. But I would give credit to government that in the case of Kilembe and the case of RVR, it was actually those very contracts that informed the process that eventually the termination happened. Now, we concentrate a lot more on it failed as opposed did we, because the contracts, you are lawyers and good enough we are speaking to a community that represents both the state and the private sector. Yeah. You agree to these processes, and to the extent that you built them into the contract and that they clearly spell out how you will divorce and the route, the journey you go through to divorce, then you have to live by that. So the temptation to go political with such a divorce is high, that we concentrate on the failure and we try to look for the blame game, but you don't actually concentrate on the resolution mechanism that is built into the contract. And for me, that's the beauty of contracting. Yeah. Because we put them there, you have helped us as lawyers to put them there. It helps us exit these marriages when we have to exit them. The other thing is people tend not to know the documentation. Paul spoke to the voluminous 200 documents and counting that constitute a contract. The appendices, the schedules and everything. Those must be read. Yeah. And those impact the entire ecosystem. The bigger the private party family, the bigger, the wider the risks and impacts. And therefore, when you are exiting or detaching, you have to be sensitive to all of those, because those will all come knocking. And therefore, that process is not for the faint-hearted. So often, and hence the direct agreement, often people will try to trigger the interventions that cure before they trigger the interventions that divorce. So the direct agreement is crafted for that, and the other mechanisms that go in.
Okay, thank you, Jim, for that explanation. And we have a question from, I think from Lorna again. How can lawyers be allowed to do their job, especially in the post-development and rollout phase of the project? She's obviously alive to issues like corruption, lack of performance by contractors, probably that's the private party. And what protection do you accord lawyers, etc.? Protection measures are in place to protect the lawyers. I think, Lorna, maybe I'll take this one. In the PPP context, at the end of the day, lawyers are hired guns. You are part of the equation, either the transaction advisor or advisor to the sponsor and the private party, or advisor to the financing party. I don't think that there's any mechanism to actually protect the lawyer. They assume that lawyers know what they're doing and they don't need any protection. But it's always good to be able to look at the agreements. I suppose that the protection is more about which client the lawyer is advising at which point. Yeah. And we've had situations where you can't advise both parties at the same time because of conflict, and their interests are naturally going to be asymmetrical in however much you try to avoid that. So I think just understand what your client needs, understand which kind of protections you can get for your clients. Understanding what a PPP is and risk allocation in a PPP, helps you a lot. Because I've actually seen lawyers go into meetings and they are arguing vehemently with government, to take, off-take risks and things like that. And the government is asking you, so why did we even bring you to the table in the first place? Because we knew you had the money, you had the technology, you had everything. So why are you now asking us to be the ones to take the design risk and all that? So I think just knowing who you're representing and what exactly you need to achieve for them in the wide world of PPPs becomes very, very relevant.
Yeah, but there's the other one I think would be also seen from a professional side. I don't know, this protection could be anything. I think when I saw the question, I said, wait a moment, lawyers actually already protected. They take professional indemnity. Orona and myself are so exposed. If anything happens, we go to Luzira straight. Nobody. So my view is this. We probably need to look at those tools that you deploy around your professional practice. Professional indemnity, we talked about it lightly, but it's so important. Yeah. We're not reinventing the wheel. If you're doing infrastructure, countries have done infrastructure. Contracts have been written. They're good contracts. You just have to call on this expertise wherever it is and deploy it. Peer review. I know there are those limitations on client protection and so on, and the confidentiality. But peer review helps. I mean, there are things you can do. But insurance. What can you insure the right insurance for the right party and the right segment of the transaction? All of these, when you get them to kick in, you're protected, and I think that's. But again, the appetite to take risk is the flip side. As we said, lawyers get well remunerated when they are doing these deals. So you're protected, and you have to pay for the protection. But you're also being well remunerated, and therefore you take the risk. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I don't see a lot of questions coming through, but I am extremely happy that there is actually a comment by Cynthia Musoke. Cynthia Musoke is our person inside the PPP unit. I've been advised she's a lawyer. So yes, the unit actually has lawyers, about 2 lawyers. Jim will just tell you their names. But thank you, Cynthia, for being proactive. I suppose that your boss will be happy with this, that you've actually given people your contact, your email address, which is on the screen, so that they can have follow-up questions with you, and hopefully also benefit from knowing what is happening, and also benefit from knowing what projects are available, and you leading them to the kind of places they want to be. So, ladies and gentlemen, I don't see any more questions. It looks like you're going to get off lightly today. We'd actually anticipated a lot more questions than this. So we'd given ourselves almost about 45 minutes for Q&A. Given that there are none coming through, there can only be 2 explanations for that. Either we were so clear that everybody understood everything we talked about, and they don't need to ask any questions, or we have successfully confused you, which goes against the whole idea about having this CLE in the first place. But
I think I think so. But I think I noted some questions early at the start. I hope the secretariat will have to pick those up, and we can deal with them. But may I mention that we actually a project-based outfit. PPP units worldwide are not, staffed with so many people. When a project comes through, then we recruit and scale up TA. So we have Sensi Amsoke seated with us, one of you, and Raija Mshabe, who works with us. But project by project, we call on resources. I know some Ugandan lawyers who have participated in Kampala Ginger Expressway. So what we did when we were structuring a deal, we then get transaction advisory at contracting authority level. And therefore, any of the members of ULSA or your partners or big law firms can apply and tender and come through as TAs for the contracting authority. So Kampala Ginger has IFC as the transaction advisor, and underneath IFC, the quite a formidable team in there. We're doing with the Gulu Logistics Hub, which was supposed to, we're dealing with it now. It's 98% built. The buildings are up. O&M is going to be PPP, and that also had an opportunity for TA services. We contracted them. I think an Indian firm is supporting us on that, and below them, there are of course advisory services that come. For those who want to know the other projects, we kind of feel free to interact with us at our offices. We structuring these, we go through processes, and whatever is approved for implementation after screening is a project we now say is ready to go into the market. It's ready to be developed to RFP and then into the market. I think that will be a good place to enter. What other firms have done, I don't know whether I'll send you a fee note for this. What others have done is they actually enable, because you specialize in pose area, you start to enable contracting authorities to realize projects. The biggest weakness, you saw we have a list, I think, of about 130. And I said at the beginning that that's a wish list. Yeah. What is happening, why we call it a wish list, is because the contracting authority lack the technical capacity to prepare them to go through the screening, the initial screening and the pre-feasibility study. Now I know of entities, and this is being done a lot more by the big five advisory firms, KPMG and all this. What they do, they handhold these entities through that initial stage, but because they're on the structuring side and the finance lender side, the mobilization, then they create a pool of potential lenders and they avail them to the contracting authority, for the contracting authority to hire the TA. And then they'll be well suited because they've already handheld them in the initial stages. So I think what the Ugandan lawyers should be doing is to see these opportunities, engage Paul, Nicholas, and others of the kind, and they help you get these projects which are still, because some of you actually retained by contracting authorities as a law firm, has retained the lawyers for these entities, but they have this problem, and they're not coming to you because they see you as a lawyer. They are not seeing you as a transaction advisor, and that's the trick we can do. So if you can do that, rearrange yourselves and go out to the Minister of Water, tell them what do you have, what project is stayed with you, what can we do to help you, and then we get them to that stage where they are able to say, oh, we actually need the TA. And the realities, and they've gone through the screening, then it is an easier conversation. The others spend a lot of money on doing things they would have tendered for. For example, a lot of the companies and the local governments and the ministries that need headquarter buildings are spending a lot of money doing BOQs. So they do the initial design and they go for the costing. And we're saying potentially all you need is an in-house architect who gives you
how much square meters,
high-level square meter needs assessment. How many staff do you have? Square meters potentially can use, cost that, and then the design becomes a competitive stage of a PPP. So you save millions of dollars or shillings to deliver that. So there are a couple of things that you can do if you start looking at yourselves from a transaction advisory point of view as opposed to a traditional legal practitioner.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, I think yes, the slides will be shared with you through the secretariat, so that you have, because I know that some people came in a bit late, Please feel free again to ask the PPP unit questions. On our side, we are very grateful to have been asked to host this. When ULS asked us to, put together the PPP training, we quickly thought that other than just meeting as lawyers and telling you what we know, probably let's take you to the source of where the projects actually sit. And this unit is this unit where the projects sit. And I know that interacting with them over time will help all of us understand how the process works, but above all, also know what is in the offing for everybody. I don't have much to say. I don't know whether the Secretariat has anything that they would want to, communicate. But otherwise, from our side and on behalf of the Uganda Law Society, I was given powers by the Vice President to officially close this at some point, and to thank you all for participating. And please just send through any comments to the head of Members Affairs, so that we know whether there are some trainings that you think can be specifically crafted for you. And where we have the expertise in-house, we will certainly be more than happy to facilitate. If we all know the same kind of information, at the end of the day, I always tell people I am more happy to have better prepared lawyers negotiating with me when we all have the same facts and the same kind of information and the baseline. It makes the transaction a lot easier. It makes the clients probably a lot conversant with the processes, and we just have a better bar as members of the Uganda Law Society together. So on your behalf, just allow me to extend thanks to Mr. Jim Mugunga, the Executive Director of the PPP unit in the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development. I would also want to thank Mr. Orono Tweyo, the Principal Technical Advisor to the unit, for sparing their half day to come and share experience with us, to answer our questions, and also to basically just take us through what they live through every day as they help hold this particular unit in place. And I'd just like to thank Paul again for the sheer amount of information that is shared with us. It's always a pleasure to sit with Paul and share ideas. And when I asked him to try and to help us make a presentation this morning, he didn't hold back anything. So I have had the opportunity of just sitting, keeping quiet, and watching the processes go. Thank you.
Alex.
I'm sorry?
There's a hand from Alex Resida.
I am advised there's a hand from Alex Resida. I don't know, can you just unmute Alex? Alex is very senior, so I am going to allow and take a question from him, if you don't mind, members. Sorry?
I advise him to unmute.
So Alex, can you unmute? Alex Resida, yeah. Sorry? Okay, so we'll assume that probably it was a stray hand. So on that note, we sorry? There's James Muhindo. James, you want to say something? I think they've unmuted you. Okay, I think it's fine. We'll just assume that probably the hands were put up randomly. But thank you very much, and we are now going to officially close. We wish you all the best, and wish you good lunch wherever you are. We're hoping that you can then have lunch. That's the only challenge of having online things. We can't offer so many things. But thank you very much, and God bless you all. Bye.
Thank you.